Welcome to Millennials Are Killing Capitalism Live. Dr. Osuna, it's good to be with you for this final episode.
Good to be with you too. Good to be with you too, man.
Yeah, so for folks who have been tuning into these, this will be a good conclusion. And honestly, I think if you haven't been watching this series, it'll still be really useful because we'll kind of talk now. I mean, we're going to talk about basically his last chapter, which is essentially a conclusion. And then we're going to talk about the preface and the foreword to the book, basically, which were introductions to the book written in two different times, essentially. One written in like 2000, 2001 by Avery Gordon, and one written with the republication in, I think, 2016, 2017, maybe a little later than that even.
The one I have is 2019, so I'm thinking it's 2019.
Okay, 2019. Yeah, so 2019 by HLT Quan. And, these give a kind of good, I'm glad, as I was saying to you before we started, I'm kind of glad we read it this way because we read through all the arguments of the book. We have a good understanding of all the things that the book's doing. And now we can look at also how these other two scholars, both of whom have very close professional and personal relationships with Cedric Robinson, frame their introductions basically to this text as well. And we can kind of, I think, talk about all three of these little pieces, talk about the book as a whole, talk about some of where our areas of disagreement might be, but also like what are the contributions of it that actually I think have quite significant value in certain ways, and so I'm excited about that.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that you started off doing it this way, the idea of starting to read the book before we even get to the preface or the intro. I would have done it that way, but I think that was better that way, in a way that we could just read it on our own first and see what our analysis is of it, and then go back to how they frame the book, right? And I think their framing is really important, given that not only they're obviously reading the text, but they knew why he wrote it. What was the intention behind writing this text, and the conversations they had with him inform how they wrote the intro and the preface, right? You could tell in the writing of it that there was a conversation with him about this text, right?
Yeah. It also, I think, really, and we've kind of talked about this passingly as we've gone through it, and I'll wait until we kind of get to those sections because I want to do the last chapter first. But it historicizes the text well, I think, which, is an important thing, right? We've talked about this, okay, it's written, it's taught in the late 80s, 90s, right? But then gets published as a book, in 2000, but probably, finalized in 99 or something like that, right? And so I think that's very important to the project that Robinson was thinking about in the time. And I think it helps us to situate Black Marxism, which is one of the things that Gordon in particular does in her piece, is kind of situate these two texts together, along with some of Robinson's other work, to help people understand a little bit more what his project were, what were his intentions behind it, what were the things he was concerned with. Because I think sometimes when we read these books now, we have a tendency to impose the concerns we have of our own conjuncture, which is just natural. But I think, there are benefits, or there are interesting things you can do when you do that. But there's also kind of a concern, I think, to read Robinson as responding to the things that we might want to respond to in our moment. And he's not doing that. He's responding to the stuff that he was encountering in his time period. And I think it's important for us to keep that, framework. And I think in general, it's something that's really important when we're talking about work of the left in the late 80s, 90s, early 2000s, because I think there can be a way that we dismiss a lot of that work, but don't really properly understand the context in which that work was generated, in which, you know, people were talking about an end of history, and the idea of Marxism and communism was essentially being taken off the table as something that could be talked about as a viable opposition to capitalism.
Yeah. Yeah, and then the other end too, like sometimes we read texts from the past and we want to apply that same analysis to the present when, you know, the political economy has fundamentally changed in different ways, right? So like we could be looking at certain theories of the 60s, 70s, or even the 20th century, early 20th century, and obviously they're useful, but there's a lot of changes that have happened. The conjuncture's changed, right? And so applying those things to the current moment are oftentimes has to be done with that in mind, right? The ideas of, for example, Antonio Gramsci, thinking of what he was writing about when it came to fascism in the 30s, although useful, there might be a lot of changes that have happened that may need to be thought out more clearly in applying that analysis, right? So when it comes to Robinson's work, similarly, right? I think as we get into it, the idea that a lot of folks have said that he was writing at the time that people were becoming more critical of Marxism or abandoning Marxism. I don't, and the authors that we read today are saying no, he wasn't necessarily abandoning them. He was just saying like we need to think about how do we save socialism from the critiques of Marx, right? How do we expand socialism beyond just that moment of Marxism, but to think that socialism will always be what this expanded, right? To rethink it. So I think that's an important contribution that we're going to be reading about today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. Well, let's move into the last chapter as a start. The last chapter is called Reality and Its Representation. It starts off, let's see, I got to pull it up real quick. I had good notes on this. It starts off with this kind of guide quote. Marxists may have to ask whether they have turned their backs too decidedly on the past, on the fact that socialism itself is in many ways the offspring of Christianity. And I mean, there's an immediate kind of knee-jerk issue I take with that, but just the point that, and it would be that I don't think socialism is unique to any, what we'll talk about a lot today is maybe the socialist impulse, right? Because I think that's kind of, in some ways, more important than talking about socialism. And this is one of my notes that I sort of take issue with in the book, is that socialism's never really defined within the text.
Yeah.
So it's not always, I don't always agree that what he's talking about is actually socialism. But I do agree with this idea of the socialist impulse, right? And this idea towards people's having a long-standing disposition across cultures, across histories, to be opposed to the kind of oppression that is endemic to capitalism, but also other forms of oppression as well, and to desire to figure out a way to live together that is more socialistic or communistic or communal, right? And so what I see in that quote, which is from V.G. Tiernan, is that his name? V.G. Kiernan.
Kiernan.
Is that within European tradition of socialism, you know, that certainly one of the points of where you see the socialist impulse expressed, right, is through these Christian traditions. I mean, I would probably also want to hedge a little bit and argue you probably find it within so-called pagan societies. You probably find it within groups of people who are also outside, even within Europe, of the Christian tradition, right? But nonetheless, part of what they're saying there is that this privileging of the scientific era and the sort of age of enlightenment and all of this stuff, this creation of these new scientific and kind of scholarly discourses, that departure in that era is not the vantage point of the arrival of the socialist impulse, which I think, I don't think Marx ever says that, but at the same time, like, I understand the wanting to make that distinction because of the way that Marxism has come to stand in for the European tradition of socialism. And I think that's one of the key things that Robinson is intervening on this text, is that it's much bigger than that.
Yeah, right. Remember, it goes pushing back on the proprietary. Say that word again. Proprietary. Proprietary impulse, right? But it goes back to that. I think his broad definition of socialism is the critique of private property, right? The accumulation of wealth and private property. That's kind of like the broad definition that he's using as far as socialism, not necessarily like state planning or nationalization of industry. Right. It's because at that point, that's when he's starting to critique these things. That the problem of how we've thought about socialism has been that state planning, industrialization, right? That these things that obviously we think about that we need for national development are also inhibit our broader view of how socialism could be thought of as something that's a humane process of developing a world alternative to private property. And what he says, I have a quote that he has that he keeps on repeating, and Avery Gordon repeats, right? The recovery of human life from the spoilage of degradation, right? So that's that broad definition, right? To think of the recovery of human life from the spoilage of degradation. And then when you think of it, that term broadly, that the idea, I think of like even Kadri's work about the accumulation of waste, right? That was talking about destruction, that capitalism is destruction. It's a destruction of human life, right? What we're seeing right now happening in the Middle East with Iran and in Palestine and Lebanon, that's the destruction of human life, right? And that the impulse, socialist impulse, is a challenge to that, right? To the challenge of destruction. What we saw happen in Cuba and the building of education, of healthcare, of meeting people's basic needs, that was the socialist impulse, right? What we see in the struggle in Vietnam and different parts around the third world, of the developing alternatives to imperialism, those were like the recovery of human life. So I think that broad definition, while some of us might be like, no, socialism is this, it's planning, it's that, I like the idea that we need to start thinking of socialism in broader terms, right? That we need that, and that in that sense also, how do we pull people in that might have been scared of even the word socialism in the first place, right? That dude, like, you have the socialist impulse in you, bro. Like, don't fear it, man. They've told you to fear your own human impulse. You know what I mean? Like, they've told you to be scared of that shit. Like, it's not, man. Like, you're cool with your neighbor. Like, how do you broaden that to a broader reach, right? And for some might that be like, that's not socialism. Socialism is this, right? And I think that's where he's saying that's the danger of it, right? And so I think this starting this chapter with that quote, you know, again, like I think about the people around me that are very Christian, right? Well, Catholic, right? But I was broadly thinking. But a lot of them have that impulse of being very communal, of being very, very wanting to be with each other. And I'm like, dude, like, how do you expand that rather than think of that? Think of the dichotomy that socialism and communism, because that's always been the thing that for them, what they've been indoctrinated with or bamboozled is that socialism has told you that it's anti-religion, that it doesn't want religion, that it doesn't want you to be spiritual, doesn't want you to have a faith or a belief. And it's like, no, that's what they've told you. And if you look at history, well, it's because these movements have had to counter the fucking church at a time. And the church that's told you not to be communal is actually in opposition to your being, right? So I think that to me is an important intervention there, to think, at least think through more deeply of how we challenge these notions in the everyday conversations we have with people, right? And so like the fact that, you know, that quote there is that the fact that socialism itself is in many ways the offspring of Christianity, not necessarily that Christianity produced it. I remember it's given that he's given us this history. It's that it's had to appropriate these socialist tendencies to challenge the movements that were challenging the institution itself, right?
Yeah. I don't want to. We'll move through because there's like I could just go off and say all my points right now, but like, you know, like in the text,
yeah,
it'll make more sense. But yeah, no, I totally agree. Yeah. So one of the things, right?
So I guess just to start. Oh, go on, go for it.
Go ahead. No, you go ahead.
No, no, go. No, I was just say just to start off, right? So he starts off with the discussion of like again the hagiography of Marx, right? That Marx and Engels. He starts off, and there's again the language this dude uses is hilarious sometimes. The invention of Marx and Marxian socialism began with by Marx and Engels themselves had several consequences for the historical representation of Western socialism and socialist consciousness. So again, the iconography of Marxism displays socialism historically, transferring its ideological, social, and material origins from the earliest recorded history to the era of capitalism. So again, I think for him, the important part is that we're constantly thinking that emerges socialism is a response to capitalism, and he's saying that socialist impulse, as we've been saying, has been there in Western civilization before that, right? But
Yeah, no, absolutely. And one of the next sort of sentence he says, with the emergence of Marxism in the 20th century as the dominant discourse in revolutionary socialism, it was possible to it was possible to rhetorically conflate the fabricated history of socialism with the appearances of a modern bourgeoisie and a specific laboring class, the proletariat. And basically, he says that it could then be possible the two classes determine the character of modern society. One class, the bourgeoisie, embodying all that was evil in the world. On the other hand, industrial labor constituting human salvation. I mean, on one level, and he does have a footnote on this that I did look at, but there's a certain extent to which he's mapping a kind of moral and also the language of salvation, right? That's a religious discourse that he's mapping that onto Marx and Engels's work in a way that I don't think they do. Now, the interesting thing is that, like China Miéville's work on the Communist Manifesto, his book on that, does kind of talk about Marx and Engels and the influence of the religious pamphleteer manifesto tradition, essentially, and that the Communist Manifesto should be read as essentially coming out of a tradition of socialist religious texts, essentially, that they use the same kind of format and that their language represents that on some level. I mean, one of the things that I would say within um, this, I had a quote of like, I don't know that they made a moral claim like that in terms of the evil and the salvation, but we might today. And this is where I think is really interesting about this book and reading it actually in this conjuncture, right? Because I think we've had these recent discussions within our Discord on the Millennials Are Killing Capitalism Discord, and people talking about the language of evil and demonic and these kind of things, and people using this in relation to imperialism, to kind of Zionism, to to the Epstein class, right? And a discussion of whether we should use the term Epstein class and this kind of thing, right? And part of what's at stake is, there's some questions about like, ableism in there. There's some questions about the kind of, do we want to use these kind of moral categories or these categories of good and evil and the way that those have historically been used, right? But on the flip side of it, it's like, yeah, but most of the world can see how evil this shit is right now. Like, why are we trying to posit a kind of rationalist secular discourse, upon some of these things when the impulse of like billions of people all over the world is to like call out the sin, the immorality, the just the utter contemptuousness of this, that it actually creates a distance sometimes, I think, for us as Marxists or as people who are like intellectual and trying to kind of rationalize all of these things when the experience of the masses, right, is one of like literally kind of a fight between good and evil. And I think that that's interesting, in this moment. I do think one of the things that this text does broadly is to, as we talked about throughout this, is to displace any kind of sh- illusion about the proletariat as the only agent of revolutionary struggle. And I think there's a lot of, I have complicated feelings about that. You probably do as well. There's certainly, I think, a utility to talking about the role of the proletariat and the working class, certainly because of also what their what their job is and their ability at their job to also grind things to a halt and all of this stuff. And but I think that historically, Robinson's point is largely correct, which is that you don't look at revolutions and say, oh, it was predominantly the industrial workers who led this revolution. Like we just, that hasn't been borne out very well by history. So I'll stop there for now. But yeah.
Yeah. No, it's true. I think that that's an important reflection, right? And again, I also have, that's something that's still, when my writing, my thinking with my students, I still prioritize the working class, right? Broadly speaking, yeah. To think about, like, when I teach my classes, I'm like, this class is taking a perspective of the working class. Like, where our analysis is important because of where we come from. The majority of my students are working class, lower strata of the middle class, and reminding them that we're speaking from that class position. We're trying to understand the class conditions of the communities we come from, right? And more importantly, dialectically, what is the class that's avoiding the ability to develop a democratic future? It's not us. It's this undemocratic ruling Epstein class, if you want to use that term, right? And really reminding them of that dialectical struggle, which he's saying has become our analysis of capitalism, the bourgeoisie and the working class. And that oftentimes that might limit our view of other movements or other struggles that necessarily don't have the class character. Now, for me, I think when you think of Marxists or those that have applied a Marxist method outside of Marx and Engels later on in the global South Third World, these questions that he's bringing up, which he does in this chapter, he also says that there's a lot of these figures that have applied this method, but I've amplified it to think about their conditions, like Amilcar Cabral, right? When I always think of Mariátegui in Peru, these individuals have rethought Marxism in their current either historical moment, but also in their relationships of the different issues that they were dealing with, whether their countries were semi-feudal, right? How do you apply a Marxist lens to a semi-feudal colony that doesn't necessarily have an industrial working class, broadly speaking, right? That it's really predominantly peasant-based, right? And it just has a small urban working class and proletariat that has to contend with that. Fanon was talking about that in Nigeria, right? Like how do you engage people in the countryside that might not necessarily have the same vision of the working class in the urban environment, right? So I think the questions he's pushing on us here in this section is a lot of the questions that a lot of us have already been contending with, right, or thinking through, especially in this current moment. But here, obviously, he's still saying that it's been a trap, because with going back to the point you were bringing about the language, the moral language of like demon and demonic and evil and wretched, right? The system being this, and that, the majority of people outside of us use that language. And I think oftentimes my students, same thing. Like with my students, I try to tell them, let's first have an analysis before we get into the morals of it all, right? But let's first understand, how does this thing work? What does capitalism do? What does imperialism do? Yeah. And once you figure that out, then you could say if it's evil or if it's great, whatever you want to say later, it's fine. But as you're saying, like, when we do that, we oftentimes do like push away people that already start from that position, right? That already have that analysis that this thing is evil. Okay, well, why is it evil? Let's break that down, right? And in the Communist Manifesto, and it goes back to what you were saying, I think if you look at Marx's writings, the Capital talks about vampires. You know, like there's the capital sucks the blood of the worker like a vampire. Like the language he uses is not always just scientific, right? And specifically the Communist Manifesto, it gives an analysis, but it's really about the morals of it all too. It's because again, it's a manifesto. That's the whole point. It's supposed to get people riled up and excited to fight, right? So I think, you know, it's a dangerous slope, because I also think about, like, I always challenge my folks not to use those languages, because they think about the other side, the right. That's how they build their popular consensus, right? If you think of when Mike Brown was murdered by that fucking cop, what did he say? He was like, I felt like this demon. He looked like a demon coming after me. Like the racist ideas of the language that oftentimes they use, right? The super predator and all these things, right? So like, again, that's how they've constructed their consensus. And so like, do we counter it by using the same language, or do we provide an analysis, right? And that's been the tension that a lot of us oftentimes have, right? Like we want to have a scientific, clear analysis, and that's what we want to provide people. Yet oftentimes that kind of goes over people's heads, right? Or they don't want to listen to that, right? And so that's the part that we have to contend with. But here he's saying like that language was there, right? It was already there. The language is in relationship to the socialist impulse, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think we'll get into that more, but I think that's one of the areas that I'll save it for like my final kind of thoughts on it, actually, because I do think that I think there's a value to analysis. I think there's a value to approaching things scientifically, whether we call that like a hard science or a soft science or whatever. I think the value of having some groundings of how we're analyzing things is very useful. And but I don't think it has to be as rigidly antagonistic towards some of these other forms of discourse that also correctly identify who the enemy is, right? And I think that's where perhaps those of us who are overly invested in the Marxist tradition end up failing to see where there are possible alliances or possible contradictions that we can mobilize in certain ways, because we get too attached to distancing ourselves from certain actors who are motivated more by a different view of why something is evil, even if we both agree that the enemy is the same. So anyway, but
I think that's the importance of a mass leader, dude. When you're a mass leader, you're able to connect those two things. When you're able to mobilize and be a good organizer is when you're able to connect the sharp analysis, the scientific analysis, to popular language, to popular's understanding, and not dumbing it down, but connecting those two things, right? And I think, in Latin America, popular education was an important tool to organizing the masses, right? Folks that might not have had a formal education, how do you bring that information to those folks, right? To workers, to peasants that were denied a formal education? You still bring that analysis with you, right? And I think that's an important aspect, that it's not necessarily one or the other. It's like, how do you build an analysis with both? And again, that to me is an epitome of a great mass leader, that you're able to do that, right? That you're able to appeal to the masses with a sharp analysis, right? And I think it's hard to do that, though, right? Because either you have such an abstract view of things, it's hard to bring it down sometimes for some folks, right?
Yeah. All right. So moving through this.
No, go ahead. So one framing that he uses, these authors, right? J.K. Gibson Graham. They have, I think, the book's called "The End of Capitalism as We Know It," or I forgot the name of the book. But it's the concept they use is capital centrism, right? And I remember reading this when I was young, a few years back. Their book about But the idea that our analysis is always necessarily in opposition to capitalism, or it's always censoring capital, the relations of capital, rather than an alternative, right? That even our analysis of the alternative is in relationship to capital, so that everything becomes very capital centric, they say, yeah. And that's that classical Marxism, he argues, and those that have built off of classical Marxism have continued with that, right? Then rather than us thinking of socialism as an alternative, not just in opposition to capitalism, but as just an alternative, it's always in relationship to it.
Yeah, I have lots of thoughts on this, but just quickly,
Yeah.
I mean, I think that there's two different. This is one of those. I hate this phrase because of how it gets deployed now. But two things can be true. but I think that what he's talking about there, right, and what they are talking about as well. The folks he's citing, Graham and Gibson, is like that. If you look at the longer history of socialism, right, and this is part of where I think, it's difficult for you or I to have this debate fully because they don't want to create any distinction between the period of utopian socialist attempts and scientific socialist projects. Whereas I would make a distinction between those two things. But and that's because I'm a Marxist at the end of the day. But I think that what they're saying is that people were trying to have socialism or building, they would say there were socialist movements, right? You could say, which I think that's maybe the best way to frame it, is that there were socialist movements before the emergence of capitalism, right? And so if there were socialist movements before the emergence of capitalism, then we have to understand it as having an autonomous history that actually doesn't actually have to do with capitalism, but has to do with the way that people desire to struggle and to live, which has a much longer lineage than the emergence of capitalism. And I think that is really important. Like that's probably like the most important thing that this book is doing, and is saying that even within the European tradition, that this is true, just as it is within, indigenous communities or, so on and so forth, right? Then, so yeah, I mean, I think that is important, and I think that it is something that Marxists, the framing of Marxism, which I don't read as a negation of that. What I read the framing of Marxism is that now that there is this capitalist system and that it is going to become a world system, that we will be able to transform that world system into a socialist system that has the ability to meet the needs of all, regardless of their ability, right? And regardless of where they situate and all of that, right? So that we can really, on a global scale or on a very large scale, democratize what is produced and direct it towards the needs rather than the wants, right? Um, and I think that is a contribution of Marxism that I have no interest in diminishing or seeking to reduce or whatever, right? And I think in some ways that's the piece that's missing in this book as a whole, because at no point do any of the authors really reckon with that question. They sort of dismiss it as an attachment to capitalism, which I don't think it is an attachment to capitalism. I just think it's an understanding of the development of the forces of production and so on, right, globally, and the ability to do something at a certain scale that could also reduce this idea of human degradation, right? Because this is the other thing, is we can't fetishize or glamorize what life is like under feudalism, or under these, or in indigenous communities or whatever. Like there's hardship. People don't live long lives. People have to work really and the idea of the development of these forces of production to a certain scale is that you could actually get to a place, and this comes up when he deals with slavery later on, where you don't have to have these systems that are so exploitive, whether they're capitalist or not. Like, you don't have to have systems where people toil and, you know, wreck their lives, that there's actually a material basis for a transition on a larger scale. And I think that's, for me, like, one takeaway from this book as a whole is that it really does kind of sidestep that question and the important contributions, I think, of the Marxist tradition to that specific question.
Well, I think, yeah, that to me, you know, that's an important point, right? From the part that's missing, or the part that I think you and I would want to contribute, or at least think through, is the actual, you know, the state projects of socialism, right? The actual, that historical moments of Cuba, the Soviet Union, of Vietnam, of the actual state planning of socialism, right? Under U.S.-led imperialism, right? How has that looked? What have they done? What kind of ways of improving the human condition has happened under these movements, under these systems, right? Actually existing socialism, as they say, right? How what have we seen, right? And I think that's the part that you're actually asking us to contribute, to think about, right? That this book is not doing, right? That's another aspect that I think, again, the manuals that we keep putting up, those are the ones that we should be looking at. The manuals that describe what the actually socialist construction looks like. And when I think about, you know, when we think of the Soviet Union and we think of the era under Stalin, oftentimes, again, it becomes this demonization of Stalin, the character, Stalin, the individual, but we don't see socialist construction. We oftentimes ever have a conversation about what did socialist construction look like under this period, right? What did it do? Right? And I think that ends up oftentimes getting lost, unfortunately, in conversations with people about socialism, because socialism becomes this abstract thing, right? And thinking of it, again, I appreciate the socialist impulse. I think that's something that we need to carry with us at all times, but also the conversation of what is the actual material construction of it look like historically, and where have been its limits, but also its successes, right? And you know, and I think that's oftentimes the part that's really difficult to grasp. You know, when I take my students to Cuba, I oftentimes tell my colleagues down there, can you please explain to us socialist construction here? What did it look like, you know, during 1959 to the present? You know, like, what have y'all done? What have been the experiments to provide food, housing, education, healthcare to everyone, right? And given the context of a whole regime of sanctions on you, y'all have been able to do things that we can't even fathom in the United States, right? Because again, we've been denied that understanding of socialist construction. So I think you're right. In that sense, I think that's an important reflection and something that invites us all to think about, like what have been the socialist construction, the projects of socialist construction in all these different places. Even when we think of North Korea, that we oftentimes don't know anything about, right? Like, what have they done to make sure people are fed, to make sure that people are housed, right? That they have health care under sanctions, right?
Yeah.
You know, so I think these are questions that I don't think this book engages with, or it's doesn't want to engage with, because that's not the project of the book. But it's still something as us that are interested in an alternative should be thinking about alongside this book.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's what you can do, right? Is you can say, okay, both there is a set of socialist movements and even attempts, we could say, on a certain scale of socialist construction with that Robinson is cataloging within this book that are fruitful areas of further research and analysis. But also there are all these other attempts in the 20th and 21st century that he's not dealing with, you know, largely. And he acknowledges that. I mean, there's a section at the end which in which he acknowledges a whole bunch of revolutions and actually does a kind of, you know, and we'll deal with it when he gets there. But he has this dismissal of vanguardism, right? And I think it's also repeated by, I think Quan in one of the intros. But Yeah, we'll deal with that. We'll talk about that when we get to it.
Well, I guess
Another
that's could be
thing,
the
I mean,
next section, right? Oh, no, go on.
yeah, well, the one part I wanted to point to is, he talks about how our focus on the development of different forms of capitalist enterprise and by implication capitalist exploitation has made it difficult to conceptualize the permanence and establishment of many non-capitalist forms of exploitation in households, shops, small factories, farms, and communes. I mean, I'll just say, like, I kind of disagree with that. um, I don't. I think actually that the Marxist framework of analysis has provided a very fruitful ground to analyze all of that, even if it wasn't necessarily a lot of the project of Marx and Engels. Although there is a little, Engels does spend some time with it. Marx does look at certain elements of it at different points, but I think a lot of people have used, particularly like Marxist feminists and so on, have kind of used these tools to then look at those other areas as sites of exploitation and extraction and all of that. So I probably would disagree on that point.
Yeah, and that's a quote from Gibson Graham, right? That you're reading. Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. It is. Yeah,
he's quoting them. He's quoting them, but no, but obviously he's bringing them in. And yeah, I agree. I think for example, the theories of social reproduction have been really fruitful in understanding these different relations of exploitation, right? In the household, in the shop, in the small factories, right? So yeah, definitely. I go back to, I think that the pushback is just the dominant approach, right? I think the approaches that you were talking about of theories of social reproduction, theories of understanding the communes, agrarian questions, oftentimes are the ones that we have to bring back up again because they're not the dominant leading understanding of a Marxist analysis, right? The agrarian question, again, constantly there's scholars that are bringing that up to say, look, you guys are forgetting about this. So I think this is where that's coming from, right? That impulse to respond to this is because of that there is a dominant approach to understanding capitalism that still leads us with thinking that the industrial revolution is the one that's going to lead us forward, and those the workers. That's still, even today, that is still the argument, right? We started this whole conversation with that we ignore the care workers, that we ignore workers that are working, that are not producing anything, that those are not the primary force. Yet in the United States, we don't produce anything. So we need to rethink how we think of class, right? But yet we still have this hard view lens. No, it's going to be the industrial worker that's going to lead the revolution. But where's the industrial worker in the United States, right? And most of them, are not necessarily in line with the Marxist lens or even a working class proletariat view of themselves, right? And so that, I think that's where that pushback is coming from again. Yeah, that raising of these ideas.
Yeah, interestingly too, it can also lead to like I know there's different variants of third worldism, but it can lead to a third worldism that says that actually the revolution has to come from elsewhere because there is no working class in the United States, essentially, right?
Exactly.
And
that too. Yeah, exactly.
I think Robinson, one of the things that Robinson is inviting with this text is to think much more broadly and promiscuously about what the revolutionary subject can be. And I think that that's fruitful for those of us who, and it kind of gets you away from trying to do an analysis through a Marxist lens is trying to identify the revolutionary subject all the time, like through some, like as if you can just kind of cook it up in the lab or something like that, or find, that it's like, yeah. All right. He goes on, he talks about Andre Gunder Frank, who I just wanted to note, like, is at least very influenced by Marx, but is kind of like comes through the like dependency theory, world systems theory, like, so he's alongside like, and I know that Robinson had he worked at the Brodel Center for a while with a bunch of the world systems theorists. And people sometimes kind of don't know that about him, but those are like some of his interlocutors is Wallerstein and Gunder Frank, and there's a couple others I'm missing, but Gunder Frank, the part he's posing is that there is, quote, not only was there no unilinear progression from one mode of production to another, but all relations of production were and remain widely intermingled even within one society, right? And to me, I think this is where I would bring in like Samir Amin to say essentially like, yes, that's true, but functionally all of that is integrated into the capitalist world system.
Exactly.
Right. And
yeah. Singer.
so
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
that's the thing for me is like, yes, of course, there are still people working in like feudal conditions or even slave-like conditions, right? But that doesn't mean that their exploitation and their forms of production are operating outside of the global capitalist system. They have been integrated at this point into it. And I think that's a point that allows us to kind of like hold both of those things, that the development of capitalism on a global scale doesn't need everything to look like an industrial factory and a like high tech, like, you know, super farm or something like that, right? That it's capable of extracting value from all of these different forms, and it serves its interests that in
Exactly.
developed countries, right, or underdeveloped countries, so called, that there aren't those forces of production present, actually.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. It makes this finds better ways of finding maximizing their value and profits that way, right? That keeping certain areas developed. You know? You use the raw materials from one place, and prevent them from actually developing their own industries, right? Developing their own heavy industries to produce their own things. So I think that, yeah, definitely that's an important point. Yeah, and again, the leading force being capital, right? The leading mode of production in this conjuncture, in this historical moment, being capital. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, so then next he goes into this point that I was mentioning earlier, right? He says, for Marx and Engels to have extended credit to backward peasants, he put that in quotes, farmers, agrarian workers, or slaves for a critical role in the formulation of Western socialism would have been an improbable event. In the German ideology, which again is written in 1840s, right, which I think is important to contextualize, Marx had insisted, quote, that slavery cannot be abolished without the steam engine and the mule and the spinning jenny. Serfdom cannot be abolished without improved agriculture, end quote. And what's interesting, I mean, he obviously responds to this by talking about that in America at the time that these technologies were being adopted, that slavery was actually increasing, that more people were being enslaved, and so on. But also to talk about that the resistance to slavery, you know, came from the enslaved themselves, right?
Yeah.
I totally agree on all of that, but I think the point that Marx is making is actually different than that. So I think it's a little bit of a like a straw manning to some extent, because I think what Marx is saying is that um, in that specific instances is that those technologies produce the possibility to move beyond those systems of exploitation, not that they will just automatically lead to the removal of them. And that's more to the point that I was talking about earlier, we were talking about earlier, of this Marxist idea of socialism as being able to address a change on a world scale rather than on a local scale. And I think this is one of the key challenges to framing things entirely in this Robinsonian kind of view of this, is that essentially one of the ways you could read his argument is like, well, any of us can just go do socialism. And yeah, like on one level we can, but on the other level, is that actually functionally a challenge to the global capitalist system? Does it actually operate outside of it? Is it actually capable of defending itself when they come for us? Like, and does our practicing socialism as a group of people help people who are enslaved in Mauritania or in you know, the system that exists in like the Gulf states, right, where a bunch of African labor is basically relatively enslaved, right? Like, so that's the thing that I would pose as a rejoinder to that point, I guess.
Yeah, no, for sure. But yeah, again, I think those are the two conversations that we're having, right? On the one end, we're like, how do you build socialism, like the actual material basis to build a global response to imperialism, and on the other end, well, who are the ones that could actually challenge socialism? I mean, challenge capitalism, right? And here he's saying, well, if we think of that, the workers are the industrial workers are the only ones that could actually challenge or actually revolt against capitalism. Like, well, the slaves were doing it before, and that we're never giving credit to these slave rebellions, right? So you're right? So that these two things are happening. That on one end, well, how do we build it? But the other end, stop looking just at the workers, that they're the ones that are going to be rebelling, because there's all these other movements that have rebelled. Maybe they did not build socialism, but there is this impulse to rebel against these things, right? And we bring this up oftentimes, right? The slave rebellions, the Haitian Revolution, right? We look at these movements that necessarily weren't socialist oriented or did not have a communist party per se, but they were a challenge to imperialism in one way or another, right? We see that happening currently, right, with what's going on in this war, that they're necessarily not led by a communist party, but they are challenging the global system as we speak, right? But again, for us, for those of us that want to uphold this tradition, is like, or believe that this is a tradition that will lead us out of this misery. Like, how do we build, enough to get us all fed and housed and with healthcare, right? Again, fundamentally, that's the basis for a lot of us, right? That we think of this, right? And so he continues building off of that. He goes in the next paragraph, 119. In their studio historical imagination, Marx and Engels had believed that socialism was the objective construction of the future, representing a decisive break with the pre-modern past. In the passage cited in the previous paragraph, Marx had ended with the declaration that, quote, liberation is a historical, not a mental act, and that it is brought about by historical conditions, the development of industry, commerce, agriculture, conditions of intercourse. The Haitian Revolution, which preceded these thoughts, did not adhere to this assertion, and later neither did the Mexican Revolution, the Russian Revolution, the Chinese, the Algerian, the Cuban, and the Nicaraguan, the Iranian. None of these were deposed by what Marx meant when he deployed the notion of history, and each contained an un-Marxian mix of either slaves or peasants, farmers, and other non-capitalist laborers. And it is no rejoinder that they proved to be imperfect. Where in human experience do such resolutions appear, right? The idea of imperfect, right? That all these revolutions were mixed. They did not necessarily weren't, again, just socialist oriented. They all had a mixture of things, but they were revolutions nonetheless. But more importantly, they were imperfect. And I think that's an important part to continue with the conversation too, right? That revolutions are imperfect, right? They're not going to be perfect, and oftentimes a lot of us want that perfect formula for revolution, right? That it's got to have it's got to have these views, it's got to have this group, it's got to have this analysis. If it doesn't have this analysis, it's not a revolution. If it's not doesn't have this party, it's not necessarily revolutionary. But given that it's something to build from, I think, for me, right? And so in this section, that passage, again, he's saying, like, as you were describing earlier, for us, we want to make sure that a revolution, or the ability to advance to another historical epoch, the epoch of socialism, we need these industries, we need commerce, we need these things to be able to build a society for all of us, right? Yet here he's saying, well, yeah, okay, but all these other movements did not necessarily have those things, and they did revolt and they did rebel, right? But again, I think that the tension that you're bringing up is still there. Like, well, but we still need those things to grow. We still need those industries. And revolutions currently still speak of those industries, right?
Yeah, and to me, this would be a good response again to what we talk about in terms of Western Marxism, right? This notion that only that really all that other stuff, like Marxists who would want to denigrate all those other revolutionary projects, would say, well, the reason that they haven't succeeded, or the reason that they can't actually produce real socialism or real Marxism, right, is because they don't have the industrial scale that we do. And that's why we here in London, right, or the United States, right, can, because we have the level of development to actually make that possible. And and so it becomes a way that Western Marxists will often propose, and you see this like within specifically like certain currents of DSA, right, or social democrats, where they will say something along the lines of like Denmark is more socialist than Cuba, right, um, or even like the United Kingdom is more socialist than Venezuela, or something like this, like some form of this, right, because of the social democratic redistribution that works within those societies, right? And you can only make that case, one, if you're like kind of racist, but two, also if you're ultimately like fine with imperialism, right? Or you think imperialism is just kind of like a policy choice that you can move away from over time, rather than like a historical development of how capitalism is actually functioning at this point, and what your whole society's wealth is actually, to a great extent built upon, right? So I I just for a second, one thing I would say is that I think if you look at Marx and Engels and the work that they did across their lives, or look at Lenin, right? If you look at these figures, they, even though they proposed certain theories, and those theories had certain suppositions, when actual revolutions happened, or when actual struggles were taking place, they looked at those places, they tried to analyze it, they tried to understand it, they tried to see the radical possibilities and the revolutionary possibilities of those places, right? So I don't agree that if we embody a Marxist analysis or tradition, that we have to rigidly adhere to certain things that they put forward in the 1840s that they didn't agree with by the 1860s or 80s or whatever, right? Like that the reality is that they were always very interested in, and this is why the part about like the products of history, I know that he quotes Marx there, and Marx has a certain way of framing that could be seen as like kind of economistic or whatever. There's that, but I think that's again talking about the historical basis of what we're talking about in terms of this large scale, big transition from one mode of production to another on a kind of global scale. I think that they were always very interested in the specifics of history, and what was actually going on. And they saw, when they talk about these struggles being determined by history, I think they mean literally like by what's going on in the real world is what is going to determine the course of this. So, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, that's an important point. I think that the fact of like his Marx's later writings and what places he was looking at, Lenin, right, all these different theorists, and I think what happens, what he's pushing back on, is those of us that, like you just said, read these texts and get really grounded on like almost reading these texts as biblical, right? That this is what it is and this is what it has to be, and realizing that it doesn't work that way. Things don't work that way. Things are messy, and I think that one of his important interventions is that for us to get away from this very rigid approach to things, and we oftentimes can be very rigid in our analysis. I will admit that to myself, that I could be very rigid in my analysis of understanding things sometimes, right? And how do we leave it open for the messiness of the world, right? Which oftentimes is very difficult to take into account in our analysis, right? Not everything can be explained by dialectical materialism, right? But again, I still believe that we have to uphold that analysis, right? Even then, that some things just are difficult to explain through them, but I still think that analysis holds a lot of weight and is very useful in understanding the world, right? But again, these different movements, these different revolutions, not even movements, revolutions, again, weren't necessarily followed the same formula. So if you think about the Cuban Revolution, it did not follow the formula of the Russian Revolution, the Mexican Revolution. They all had their own unique characteristics and conditions. The Iranian Revolution to this day, right? It's been very distinct. The Nicaragua, very different, right? And so they've all been very different. Even when Fidel went to visit Nicaragua, he said, "This is not going to be another Cuban Revolution. It's going to be their own revolution. It's going to have its own characteristics," and it did, right? And again, some people could say that's what's been the detriment of the Nicaragua Revolution today. What has it emerged? What does it look like today, right? And you think of what we've called 21st century socialism again. What has that been look like? How has that developed? Where are we at with that today? Yeah, these are all different These are all different conditions that we have to unpack and understand in their own realities that oftentimes don't follow that formula that we've been told is supposed to be followed, right? And so some people could be arguing, this is what you were bringing up earlier, and that's why they fail, because they haven't followed the formula. There's a formula to revolution, and they haven't followed it, and that's why they haven't succeeded, right? And I don't know. I'm kind of torn with that. I don't know if that's the right way of thinking about it, right? Because the formula,
Yeah. Well, and I think though, I mean, this kind of is a good bridge between this point and the next one that he makes, because on the one hand, what I would say, in part in response, is that if you look at many of those revolutions that he lays out, right, there are Marxists within them, right? Or, and look, I mean, I do on some level want to get away from the proprietary impulse, which is reflected in a statement like that, right? Because it sort of becomes like, okay, like we want to claim this, but I also mean that there are people who would have articulated themselves in that way, right? Like there are people within these movements, whether it's, I mean, Russian Revolution, there's a lot of them. Chinese Revolution, there's a lot of them. Nicaragua, there's quite a few, right? Like, Iran, there are many. And so there is, as you're talking about too, and I think this is a really important point, there are local histories, local traditions, different struggles going on, different viewpoints, different epistemologies, histories, all of that. Like it is a big freaking mess, right? Ideologically and politically, and it's much broader than I think some people want to give it credit for when they make that kind of proprietary claim. But on the flip side, like you also can't deny that especially if we're talking, just to give examples of the Russian Revolution and the Chinese Revolution, that there is a strong influence of Marxists, organize, like it's just a big part of the socialist tradition that is entering into those places, that is being applied locally, and who are the revolutionary agents of history and all of that are being determined and talked about locally and all of that stuff. But you can't deny, kind of the influence of it on those struggles and on many others, right? So there's that point. But then this is where I think we get to a little bit more of an interesting point, which we kind of already talked about. He says, as I have attempted to demonstrate in the preceding chapter, transfixing the origins of socialist theory, and he's saying socialist theory there, right, to the work of Marx, has also served to suppress the natural history of Western socialism and to restrict its theoretical and practical development. And I think this is kind of, and then he goes on to this thing about like kind of this discussion of like Marxology, right? Or these people who want to look at intellectual provenance and they want to go from Marx to Hess and then to Hegel and then to Kant and then keep going back, right? And so they're looking for the genealogy of socialism within European academia, essentially, right? Going all the way back. And he's saying like, no, you should look to the actual tradition, struggles, movements, and theory that's coming out of those movements as the site of the development of Western socialism, which is something that Marx and Engels are encountering and then working into this kind of intellectual tradition, right? And at that point, the thing that he basically chastises Marx and Engels for doing, right, is by making this distinction between utopian and scientific. They're basically saying, like, all that shit, you had good ideas, but you couldn't do it. Now we can, and this is how. And we're making this kind of distinction, right, between this kind of religious history mostly, not necessarily religious like it's all, but people who are approaching this often through kind of a religious framework, um, that that's distinct from the scientific framework that we're putting this all on and moving forward. I think that's a really important point, because I think part of what it allows us to do is to say that just like China, Nicaragua, Russia, Mexico, wherever else, right? Venezuela, like there are these admixtures of different currents, and like they draw on, indigenous traditions or religious traditions, and, try to organize these in a specific way towards their movements and their revolutions, that's also possible within Western societies, because we also have multiple different bases of this socialist impulse. And so we don't need to do this like atheistic, secular, like cutting off and follow this kind of, it has to be the industrial proletariat, it has to be this, da 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 da, like that he's basically saying that's was what Marx and Engels got wrong, or at the very least, that's how the interpretation of their work within the academy and within Western Marxism has gotten it wrong.
Yeah, and remember that the critique he also is having, that the Marx and Engels are responding to the utopian socialists prior to them, but there were, even before that, there was a socialist impulses that they weren't looking at, because they were responding to the utopian ones, right, from the French Revolution, right? So that before these dudes, there was all this other movements that they could have responded to or looked at, studied more seriously, be farther back than the utopian ones, right? And this is where our story starts. Our story of Marxism starts with Marx was responding to the utopians, the young Hegelians. But before the young Hegelians, there was all these other movements, and not necessarily theorists or academics, actual movements, right? Like rebels that were challenging the private property of the Catholic Church, of the church, right? And that those folks we forget about, because we're stuck in this story here. And so that, again, as you're saying, like there's this Western tradition of socialism that we could look at and say there's stories to build off of that, from that, learn from, right? That we oftentimes have ignored because of, again, the way we've been told this narrative, right? That you just said, that the Marxian academic texts, we study these different characters that were all petty bourgeois themselves, but not necessarily the movements that were pushing the class struggle, if we're going to use those terms, because that's how we use those terms. That was a class struggle before these dudes against the church, right? That we oftentimes have not been looking at. That I think this book wants us to go back to, and like, what can we learn from them now? Even in this current moment, what can we learn from them now, right? I don't necessarily have the answer right now, but one definite response immediately would be to really challenge the Western Marxism that a lot of us are currently rethinking through, right? That he was already thinking through as well, right?
I mean, I think one of the things that it's helpful with for me in this current moment is also as a response to what I would call Western Marxists, right, who can't see revolutionary potential or a subject that they want to identify with within Iran, within the axis of resistance, within Palestine, within Lebanon, right? And to say, these are people fighting for dignity, right? They're fighting against that, what was it, the spoilage of humanity? I can't remember the exact term that keeps coming up. The degradation, right, of human life and all of this thing, right? And like that they don't have to narrate that within a Marxist or a communist discourse in order for us to be in solidarity with them, right? Which like to me should be an obvious point, and I've arrived there long ago without necessarily this, but I think it helps us to understand that just because a movement is religious, and this also gets into a lot of like there's a lot of Marxists, there's a number of Marxists who really don't like Islam, right? Like have a kind of knee-jerk, this is a reactionary, backwards, da 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 da, right? And they're not even engaging with all of the things within Islam, right, that are actually socialistic, that are actually communal, and the fact that this is a historical development out of a people in another part of the world, right? And and so because of their like, I think unfortunately it's the connection of like the atheism, the privileging of kind of like the secular ideas, and the kind of enlightenment stuff that gets in the way very often of this kind of a necessary solidarity between people in the global north and people in the global south. But I think, what Robinson is saying is like, you don't have to be atheist to be a socialist, right? Which is like, I think, I think an important thing for people to say, right? Like, so.
Yeah, for sure. Not for sure. Yeah, definitely. I think that's an important reflection there. An important point. That's like you said, though, I think a lot of us have arrived there without this text, and unfortunately, he felt that he had to write this text for some of the socialists to listen. Like for some of us we've already arrived there, but I think it's unfortunately a lot of our folks, a lot of our friends on the left don't have that analysis, right? Oh man, I was going to say something else, but I just lost my train of thought. But I think that again, that's such an important, useful thing to carry with. And I just go back to, again, I keep on saying this, that for me, it's been really helpful to think about like that there's these renegade Europeans that weren't necessarily down with what was going to come next, right? That they weren't okay with what was developing in Europe, that they weren't necessarily okay with the expansion of capital abroad and would be start to colonize the world, because they themselves already saw that as something that was a failure in human history, right? And so that also pushes me to think about like how, in his word, people oftentimes say that he's essentializing race, right? That it's all the Europeans, it was just all white people were just racist. And it's like, that's such an unfair reading, you know what I mean? Like he's already telling you here, nah, man, the work already is showing you like there was a renegade group of folks out there, that we should be looking at. If he was such a black nationalist or someone that was so race reductionist, he would not be looking that direction. He would not be off telling us to look that direction. He would have been telling us, just look at Africa. Africa is the only solution to everything else. He's never said that. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like,
No, he's not saying Europeans are a bunch of cave people and we have a I mean, he does talk about us. He does talk about us as a backwater of civilization or whatever. But like,
but there's renegades up in y'all. Man.
Yeah. No, I agree. I mean, I think that we could talk about the ways in which we think this book is. I think there are areas at times where, to me, it feels a bit unfair to Marxism, and again, like this is kind of becomes the like, how are we defining some of these terms, right? And what happens when we put everything under one big, brand umbrella, right? When there are so many different branches and variants of this thing. But on the flip side, what I would say is that it's super generous to European people, as having their own radical traditions and being opposed to patriarchy and slavery and all of that kind of stuff, right? Like it's actually like really trying to narrate a counter history that is not focused on like colonialism, settler colonialism, slave, like he understands those things as part of really like ruling class historical projects. And is saying like, yeah, there's a lot of people who went along with them, but look at all this history of the people who were against these, these systems, right? And so I actually think it's a very good response to anyone who takes him as just like, hating white folks.
Yeah. Let's see. Let's move on. What do we want to touch on next?
Well, let's move down. So, I mean, I didn't really understand the Engels point he was making entirely. I think he just talks about how, Engels dwelt. This was at the end of their lives. I mean, part of what he's talking about is that they change some of their emphases, and he focuses on Engels in this at the ends of their lives. I mean, I would say they change a lot of their emphases, and I think it's really interesting some of the stuff that they are working on towards the end of both of their lives. But Engels dwelt on two revelations of a conceptual nature. One, that the mode of production formed, quote, the foundation upon which state institutions, the legal conceptions, art, and even the ideas on religion of the people concerned have been evolved. So this is kind of like the discussion of the superstructure, really. And two, that surplus value revealed, quote, the special law of motion governing the present-day capitalist mode of production and the bourgeois society that this mode of production has created, end quote. And it's interesting. I don't really understand the point that he's making there. He says, more credibly, Engels confirmed Marx's originality in the construction of historical materialism and its application to their own era. So maybe what he's trying to say is that their view of what historical materialism like changed a bit from what it had been earlier, which I'd say is definitely true. I mean, they continued to think about these things over their lives.
Well, I think he's doing exactly what we've been saying that he wasn't doing, right? That the whole time we were like, oh, he's not acknowledging that they're changing their minds. This passage is saying, that they changed their thoughts. There was a sense of understanding that maybe what they were developing at first didn't completely. They started questioning the way the previous the way they've thought about previous movements, or how they were engaging, and how historical materialism develops, right? Because in the following passage, he mentions how, to be certain, as we have seen, the existence of previous socialist discourse was subsequently investigated by a few Marxists. Marx himself had acknowledged older socialist impulses, only to dismiss them as deceits or anachronisms. But Karl Kautsky, Engels' collaborator and the editor of several Marxist posthumous publications, was one of the Marxists who examined early Christian communism as well as the socialist works as Thomas More in the 16th century. So the fact that they were engaging them, but that, again, they necessarily didn't see them as viable options, right? Of how do we build social? But it goes back to the point that we were describing earlier, right? Because Marx's project was that how do we build from what we have? Like how do we construct socialism out of what capitalism has already done, right? How do we build from that? So that was his project, right? Here Robinson is saying, well, that was a project that was ignoring other projects. So I think it goes back to like what was the project at hand, right? And so Marx's project was, no, we're going to build socialism from what capitalism has already given us, right? And that's why the industrial working class would lead us, because again, they're the ones that have organized production, right? They're the ones that know how to organize production and produce for everyone. Because all of us over here are just sitting. I'm just sitting here writing. I can't produce anything. I'm just writing and analyzing. The workers are the ones that know how to make things. They're the ones that are going to advance socialism forward, right? So I think that engagement was there.
Yeah, I mean, and it's interesting. I mean, he has some stuff on Kautsky here in this work. I mean, I highlighted a few points. In short, the base was insufficient to sustain a fugitive radicalism in the superstructure. I would agree with that perspective. But also, you know, he talks about Kautsky was willing to concede that the revolt against the papacy was essentially a struggle between exploiters and the exploited. He found the popular resistance to the church little beyond, quote, superstition and fanaticism, cruelty and bloodthirstiness developed to insane lengths. And this, again, I mean, it connects to something Yipper said in the chat. Marx's Euros also weren't with, you know, John Brown. But I think that that's the, you know, this is one of the things, and it again gets to the kind of point I was talking about earlier about wanting to, I mean, it's funny because that is a kind of moralistic frame that's being placed, as well as a kind of psychopathological frame that's being placed upon these movements. And so that's interesting, right? Because here we have this, what should be a rational discussion, right? Because if they're Marxists, right, you know, you'd think that they would, but yeah, they're describing these movements in certain ways as irrational or as like exceeding the limits of rationality and like proper behavior and all of this kind of stuff. And I think that's an interesting thing to think about within the Marxist tradition, is that there is this like, well, in certain ways it wants to move away from these moral characterizations towards discussing historical conditions, that you actually can find instances where they resort to a kind of moralistic, you know, or pathologizing framework to then diminish other movements, which is an interesting thing. But they're saying that it's the religious fanaticism, right, that makes them that way. And so it's again really attached to this critique of a movement, particularly a movement that might use political violence, right? Doing so through a religious framework. You know, it's an interesting thing there. Yeah. I didn't have much else on that other than, I mean, he does talk about, I did highlight this. He says, quote, what Lenin, Trotsky, and Stalin might have apprehended, for example, from the Jesuit experiment in Paraguay was denied them. The Jesuits had opposed Indian slavery through the promotion of native rebellions and the securing of slave labor from Africans, which I don't know why we would want to learn from that. But rebellion exposed the missionaries to the contagion of power, just as earlier African slavery had compromised the tenets of Dominican theology and their moral community. Similarly, the Russian revolutionists fell victim to the seduction of power insinuated in the empire to which they became heirs, and their failure to extend autonomy or civil rights to national groups like the Ukrainians or classes like the kulaks encrusted the communist state with ethnic and social oppositions. I mean, I'm really not with, my comment in the margins was, I'm not with this. But I think that paragraph is doing a lot of work that like we would have to interrogate on a much deeper level. But it does speak to his antagonism towards, you know, towards the Soviet Union, at least.
Towards state socialism.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah, right. The construction of socialism through the state, right? I think that's his antagonism, because I think of like Walter Rodney's in the Russian Revolution. He has a whole section on the kulaks, and he talks about like, well, what Stalin had to do, right? What was the response to the kulaks, right? And actually Rodney was very like, had a very positive, well, not, I wouldn't say positive, again, we're doing moral discussions, but he had a sharp analysis of why Stalin had to do what he had to do at that moment, right? And so I think that it would be a good reference to read Walter Rodney in relationship to this paragraph, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and it's one of the things that, go ahead.
No, I see the point about like what, and this is part what we've been talking about, right? Like, what have we been denied when we don't look at these movements, like these previous movements that we don't study because they necessarily don't look socialistic or not, or right? So, like the idea of the Jesuits in Paraguay, again, as although he says earlier they weren't as perfect as we would think they were, but what developments or what form more modes of relationships existed that we could learn something from, right? And again, I think this is the part of Robinson that's very useful that a lot of us oftentimes don't do, is like we could learn things from things we don't look at or we don't want to look at because we don't think there's something to learn from. And he's like, actually there is, right? Even if it's like, again, going back to Western socialists, you would assume there's nothing to learn from them, but there actually is, right? Western radicalism prior to Marx and the utopian socialists, there's something to learn from them if you just go back there, right? And again, for me, it's the radical rebellions against the church, right?
Yeah.
But again, that's what the useful part of that paragraph.
Yeah. So this next part I'll read aloud. I think it's a good section. Mm-hmm. So he says, the reductionism which became so characteristic of later Marxists was only partially the responsibilities of Marx and Engels. Indeed, as is known, Engels explicitly warned against such error. Well, it is the case that Marx and Engels considerably narrowed the domain of Western socialism's genealogy. It must be acknowledged with equal candor that they also achieved a rather remarkable and fecund portrait of modern capitalism's early development. Without their intervention, radical politics in both the West and elsewhere might have very well lacked the conceptual purchase which proved so important at the peripheries of the world system in the resistances to imperialism and colonialism which have decorated the 20th century. And so I did appreciate that section. I appreciate the following. Actually, I'll read the rest of the paragraph because there's other stuff in it, but and then we can talk about the whole thing. He says, neither can it be said that Marx and Engels were solely responsible for the doctrinaire and near religious authority extended to their treatment of history. Theirs was an abundantly fertile legacy, which, as Lenin, Mao, Fidel Castro, Amilcar Cabral, CLR James, and other non-Western revolutionists have so effectively demonstrated, could inspire creative and imaginative thought as well as idolatry. But these come very close to the mental act with which Marx was not infatuated. Nevertheless, if not the privileged place so often claimed for it, it is certain that Marxism occupies a place in socialist history. And so I appreciated that paragraph. It's obviously like probably the most, he gives flowers a little bit to the Marxist tradition in this whole book of saying, like, you know, without their work that, you know, the development of socialist history would look very differently, and we wouldn't have that they made important contributions to a bunch of the people who are the people that we often highlight as wishing Robinson had spent more time talking about.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that gets, for me, and this is my position and my argument, that to read Robinson, you have to start from that position. If you want to read Robinson's work, you have to read Robinson's work from this paragraph forward. Oftentimes, people read Cedric as an anti-communist forward, not from this paragraph forward. Like, if you read him from this paragraph forward, you're understanding what he's trying to do. He's trying to say, look, dude, like, all of us are down with this project, but there's limits that you guys are ignoring. There's gaps, there's blind spots that we could learn from if you just take the time to study those gaps, those limits. Don't get tied down with dogmatism, idolatry, hagiography. That has been a danger to our movements. You know, going back to Amilcar Cabral, tell no lies, claim no easy victories. Like, if you're doing that, it is a danger to our movement. So I usually, when I read Cedric, when I think of his work, I think of it from this paragraph. You know, but again, that's my position. My others might say, no, he was totally anti-communist. He was not what you're saying he was. But from my position, when I read his work, the usefulness of his work for me starts with this paragraph moving forward. And that's how I'm able to read this book and not come out with, he was anti-communist. Marxism has nothing to do with us. Let's just move on from Marxism. Let's throw it in the dustbins of history. There is another tradition out there that's going to lead us to socialism. No, that's not what he's saying, and that's not how I would read it, right? And I would think that would be a very detriment to our humanity if we do that, because this has been actually what's led our movement, our society forward, is the Marxist communist tradition to lead us towards socialism and eventually communism, right? But in that advancement, we need to be able to find the gaps and limits and movements that have been ignored because they weren't communistic or because they weren't leading. They didn't have a pamphlet that said we're communists. They didn't have a pamphlet that said we're socialists, right? But they were actually challenging the terms of order, and we need to learn from those how they challenge them and how do we build them into our movements or apply them to our movement, right? So this paragraph here, right, like it's perfectly said, right, that if it wasn't for this analysis, would we have the sharp analysis to challenge the world system as we do today? Probably not, because they actually were the ones that put it in writing for us to actually have to challenge with it, right? They weren't the ones, well, they were involved in movements, but they're the ones that put it in writing for us to able to then build back and be, okay, how do we understand the relations of production? How do we understand the modes of production? How do we understand ideology? And thinking of Gramsci moving forward and the ideas of common sense, right? These different characters that he mentions, individuals, Lenin, Mao, Fidel Castro, Amilcar Cabral, Cyril James, and other non-Western revolutionists, right, offer us so much to build, right? You know, I'm thinking of right now in the Sahel region, right? The homeboy what is it? What's the country? Yeah, right.
Burkina Faso.
Burkina Faso, right? Like studying that, and it's very useful to think about how some folks are like, he ain't Sankara, so let's ignore him. Right? Some folks are saying, like, you know, that he ain't Thomas Sankara, so like that's not that. Let's move forward. That's such a error there. Like why not? Like why not study? Yeah, you're right. He's not Sankara, but there's something happening there that we should try to study and understand. That they're trying to do something in the current conjuncture of U.S.-led imperialism right now. Like, what does it look like? What does it study? Right? It would be a detriment to ignore him because he himself is not speaking like Sankara, although he's saying he's carrying on the lineage, right? But there's some folks that I've heard say that that's not that. He's not that. So let's ignore him. And I think this is the paragraph is kind of saying, like, how do we expand our understanding of things?
Absolutely, yeah. No, I agree. And I mean, I think that's true for many others too, right? Whether it's like Hassan Nasrallah or like, you know, people from, Iran, right? You know, I mean, Larijani just was martyred yesterday. Like, there's just so many figures, right, that out there. And it's like, you know, don't just dismiss, like, take people seriously. You know, I think that's, you know, part of it. Yeah. All right. So he goes in like this is the go ahead.
Well, I was going to finish it off, right? So like he says, as the past and our present demonstrate, dominations and oppression inspire the spirit in ways that we may never fully understand. That a socialist discourse is an irrepressible response to social injustice has been repeatedly confirmed. Again, this is confirmed, man. You know, like the socialist impulse or socialist discourse is part, just like capitalism has been, you know, part of our history, socialism has been part of our history. On that score, it has been immaterial whether it was generated by peasants or slaves, workers or intellectuals, or whether it took root in the metropole or in the periphery, right? He's like, what matters is that there's a socialist discourse and impulse that we need to carry forward, right? And I think, again, we could read this book and be like, oh, he's ignoring the workers. He says Marx and them are not useful. He's like, no, they're useful. The problem is that y'all on the other end have ignored all the other ones. So how do we build a socialist discourse incorporating all these different movements rather than just saying this is the one that we need to be looking at and nothing else?
Yeah, no, absolutely. All right, so let's move into the foreword and the preface. Try to move through these a little bit quicker. I have actually some, like, if you want to start with the foreword.
Yeah, so let me see.
And then I have some notes I can pull up so we can kind of like skim through some of this, I think.
So let me see. Let me find the passage. I think, there's I don't remember where I pulled this quote from, but Quan's talking about like a different, and I think they're referring to the moment where like that this was a reader, right? That this was a seminar that eventually becomes a book, right? So this was something that a theory seminar that Cedric was doing at Santa Barbara, but that what he was offering his students was a different approach to studying socialism. One that elucidated the fact that socialism reappears constantly in different contexts with different actors. At minimum, this phenomenon suggests that it is possible to study a culture of socialism and hence an anthropology, right? So that there's a coach, and again, this goes back to what me and you have been talking about this session, right? That there is a study of culturally studying socialism and actually existing socialism, right? These are two different things, I think, that we could bring in conversation with each other. But that oftentimes we're interested in, well, how has socialism as a practice concretely been developed, right? And that's actually existing socialism that has been historically demonized in this country, right? And then on the other end, there's the culture of developing socialism, right? The reappearance of it in different contexts with different actors, right? Obviously, those two things are not, to me, are complementary, right? When I go to Cuba with my students, again, one aspect is, the socialist construction that I want students to understand. But then there is the cultural revolution aspect of Cuba, right? And one thing that oftentimes my colleagues in Cuba laugh at me is in Spanish, I say usted, like in respect to my elders, usted. And they laugh at me because they're like, dude, we don't do that here in Cuba. I'm like, what do you mean? Like, you're my elder? No, because that's like a very like feudal relationship where it's like you see me as the, usually you Mexicans, you say usted because you guys are used to working in an area where you have a landlord that controls the land and you have to work with them, and they get that relationship of usted, right, of respectful relationship. A revolution transformed that, right? They don't necessarily refer to each other like that. Like there's respect to your elders, but it's not like that language of usted. That's something that was taught to a lot of us at a young age, right? Because if you don't say that, it's a sign of lack of respect, right? That practice, that culture was very important. That oftentimes my students come back like amazed by, right? Like, wow, like these, and so this aspect of studying the culture of socialism. Now, I don't think Quan's necessarily referring to that. They're referring to like the different attempts and cultural practices in history. But to me, that also elucidates that part too. Like that there's this aspect of studying socialism as an anthropology of culturally, how it develops is very useful for us to think about our practices in general, right?
Yeah. And I mean, I don't think we've said this enough probably, but it does bear saying is that specifically within the work of Marx and Engels, right? If we focus there, but also within a lot of even academic Marxism, and this goes back to the capital-centric, discussion, that it becomes an exercise of critique of capitalism. It becomes a discussion of how might revolution be possible, and what are the kind of conditions that could bring that around, and so on and so forth. But there is definitely there's much less work done on studying socialism, even in terms of actually existing socialism, right? Just studying those societies, right? There's much less done of that. And I think part of what both I mean, I know HLT Quan's politics are a little bit, well, they may be quite similar to Cedric's actually, but they're both like, they have a kind of interest in socialism, but also kind of an anarchistic, bent a little bit. That, looking at socialism, and being broad in that, and not just looking at actually existing socialism, but looking at all this broader history, you know, that not studying that and not looking at that produces a lack within Marxist literature of actually being able to, imagine what does the new society look like? How do we build it, right? This is something that, for instance, in Venezuela, they have tried to really do, is to think through, then that's what the commune system is all about, right? Like, as you think through, how do we actually build socialist relations, and build those up over time to a place where they can then replace capitalist relations, rather than just thinking about, okay, nationalizing, the industry and everything else, and doing a kind of what people would call a state capitalist approach, right? And so, I do think that there's some value to the state capitalist approach also in a transitional framework, personally. But I think that so I don't even use that term. A lot of times that term state capitalism is used kind of as a denigration, right? Saying like, oh, these countries didn't actually use socialism, they did state capitalism. But I do think that there is a like Torkel Lawson talks about this a lot within his work, of like any project of socialism that has existed, whether we even acknowledge it as actually existing socialism, that there is capitalism present there, and then there are attempts to develop other things and to look at how do we use this in a way for our society rather than for the benefit of imperialism or global capitalism, right? Like, how do we redirect some of these things to the benefit of our people en masse, right? Which is something that capitalism doesn't try to do at all, right? Like, as a regular separate system. So that's,
I've been
go ahead.
Yeah, I think of, like, what's really helped me think about these things and think about like capitalism and the transition towards socialism, the Maoist views of like the line struggle, right? The analysis of like that capitalism, it's a line struggle between capital and socialism constantly, right? That there's a constant struggle. Even within socialism, the class struggle doesn't end, right? There's a constant class struggle, and that's why there's revisionism and capitalism can return, right? It's not completely done with, right? And so that the culture of developing socialist practices is very important, right? Here, moving forward in the passage, she has an important point. They have an important point where, like, well, Robinson's contributions to reforming our understanding of Marxism and Marxism's writings are many and invaluable. Anthropology should not be read simply as a critique of Marxism or even a rehabilitation of Marxist historiographies. Instead, Robinson's site is on socialism writ large, right? So again, going back to that point, right? This is not about whether it's about expanding Marxism or critiquing Marxism. It's about socialism and the socialist impulse. That the book's about the socialist impulse that oftentimes gets, again, just taken down to just Marx and Marxism. Not thinking that there's again, we've been saying all this entire sessions, right? The idea of expanding socialism beyond just Marx, right?
Yeah. So you get also, you get the anti kind of vanguardism, anti-Soviet, stuff within Quan's, forward here. But one point that they make that I thought was really important, is she talks about, or they talk about, the socialist impulse that will survive Marxism's conceits, just as earlier it persevered the repressions of the church and secular authorities, right? That's a quote from Robinson. But then Quan says, in other words, just as it historically predated Marx and Marxism, socialism will assuredly prevail beyond the nominally understood terms of Western socialism. This is remarkable, a remarkable declaration in the wake of the political and historical developments of the late 1980s and early 1990s in the West, when many proclaimed socialism to be dead or dying. And I think that is a really important point that Quan is bringing up there, right? And we've kind of referenced it a little bit in passing along the way, but understanding this text as being published in 2000, right? In a time when, other than Zapatismo and Chavismo, really, like, there are not r- recent projects or reasons why people are hopeful about a development of kind of a socialistic politics, right? And Zapatismo obviously gets connected in with anarchism, in a certain way, even though I know it's a mix of things, but it also was not interested in trying to take the state, right? It was not, it was not a project that was trying to take over the Mexican state, essentially. And then Chavismo is, right? And there's not really an engagement there, but it's also still fairly early in, like, this is before, like, Chavismo takes a much more kind of socialist turn a little bit later. I mean, it always has those currents within it. But I only say that to say that it was a time which in some ways is like our time, where the prospects of socialism seem quite bleak to folks. But I think in specific, they quote Fukuyama and others, right? And talking about this idea that the discourse at the time was that history is over and that capitalism and neoliberal capitalism is the order of the world forever and ever, amen, right? um and so as a result of that, what part of what this project from Robinson's intention was is to say we can recover the socialist impulse and look at some of these different bases to recover that we haven't even engaged with very seriously, right? And that we don't actually need the Soviet Union, or we don't need China to remain a beacon of socialism globally to recover our own socialist, or to not even our own, because he's talking to Europeans here, but to recover socialist traditions, right? And they connect this in, of course, also to Robinson's work with Black Marxism as trying to identify different bases of Black radical tradition for, Africana communities, Black communities. Yeah.
Yeah. I want to read that passage after that part. So he says, Robinson's clear-eyed understanding of the historical formation of socialism is especially notable when contrasted with the general breathless reception evident in the works of his contemporaries. Both Francis Fukuyama's The End of History and The Last Man and Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations prematurely and erroneously celebrated the end of ideological struggle, especially those between capitalism and socialism. With the dissolutions of the Soviet Union in December 91 and Europe's Eastern Bloc in December 89, socialism was presumed to be no longer viable in the New World Order of corporate globalization and the neoliberalization of everything. Capitalism in the form of neoliberalism was thus presumed to have already demonstrated its own mastery and triumphed over its existentialist foe, socialism. In the wake of these developments, and within the context of what Martin Jay characterizes as fin de siècle socialism, quote unquote, Robinson's optimism is an unwavering act of faith in the ability and role of ordinary women and men to make their society anew. It is in contradistinction from the ever fretful wondering about whether there still might be a quote unquote left, right? So for Robinson, is neither historically accurate nor analytically sound to even contemplate binding the fate and politics of the demos with an elite hagiographic endeavor whose conceits have long been exposed. So yeah, right. So I think the point here again, it's the argument again. Our dominant argument I've heard about his work is that he's writing at a time that people were already punching socialism while it was down, so he jumped on that train to punch it down even further. Right. That was his project, and he pretty much was the proto Afro-pessimist and proto identity politics and postmodernism. It was his fault that all this comes to be. Right. Again, if you read this book and you read this project, what he's trying to show us is that no, there's the radicalism and impulse exists, and that we still have to have the faith that we could continue to struggle despite the fact that some of these projects were beaten. Didn't fail, were beaten, right? So again, the language of failure, we ignore sanctions, we ignore counterinsurgency, we ignore all that if we just talk about failure, right? Did they have internal contradictions? Yes, but again, this was an imperial project of making sure that they did not succeed. At the time that this is happening, if we look towards Cuba, you have Fidel Castro talking about ideological struggle, the struggle over ideas, right, in the 90s, right? That the whole campaign, they develop a whole campaign to do pretty much what this guy's doing, what Robinson's doing in this project of recovering the socialist tradition. In Cuba, they have this idea of recovering the socialist tradition in Cuba, right? Of bringing back the socialist impulse that even brought the Cuban Revolution in the first place, because they're suffering under this special period, right? When the Soviet Union collapses, the U.S. starts to strangle them even further. What does Cuba do? Most countries at the rise of neoliberalism, most countries in Latin America start structural adjustment programs. They go neoliberalism on steroids, start cutting and privatizing everything. Mexico, Central America, right? In Venezuela, they have the rebellion in '89 in response to this. But what does Cuba do instead? Instead of privatizing, they expand their healthcare services. They expand education, despite the fact that the Soviet Union collapsed. That's a very notable aspect of that history in Cuba that we oftentimes don't take into account, because we think about it just as the special period, that it was really rough, which it was. But during that special period, the Cuban government decides to invest more in education and healthcare. With whatever they have, they put that money into that, which then gets them out of this situation, right? Obviously, some people have argued that they never really left the special period, that it's always been that struggle ever since then. But they were able to provide infrastructure, and it was why? Because of the ideological struggle, which here Quan is talking about, right? That impulse of continuing the ideological struggle. But in Robinson's work, he's saying, let's go back to this period of Western socialism that we oftentimes never look at, right? Even farther back than the utopian socialists.
Yeah. I don't have a whole lot more on this particular piece on Quan's section. I don't know if you have anything else there. I mean, there's the discussion of like different discourses. They bring in Pope Francis, right, which is kind of interesting. You know, I mean, in the context of this is in the context of the first Trump administration that Quan is writing this and talking about. You know, Pope Francis's interest in the environment, but also in understanding, you know, the degradations of like capitalism and colonialism, and being kind of a foil to Trump, which, you know, many kind of saw him as. Also brings in Naomi Klein. I mean, one of the things that I would say about some of this is that, yeah, I don't dismiss all of this stuff, but there's a number of thinkers cited and kind of places that this goes that wouldn't be the places I would go. Whether that's Klein or, you know, I mean, I think the Francis thing is interesting because I think part of what we could talk about with Pope Francis is that say like that some of those things that he said or purported to be about, right, that these have long bases within Catholicism and within the Christian tradition that are actually even more radical than he was. And that he wouldn't be able to be the kind of figure that he was if there wasn't that kind of basis within the Christian tradition as well.
Yeah, and again, you know, the point, right, that this book excavates the archives of popular anti-property sentiments and collective struggles against the church and the ecclesial orders, along with the secular authorities, not unlike our own, right? So I think, again, when we're talking about definition of socialism, right, what do we mean by socialism? Again, for most of us, it's national state planning, centralized planning, right? But the impulse is the anti-private property and collective struggle, right? I think that's another aspect of how we could conceive of socialism. But I also want us to be clear what we mean by socialism too, right? In this current moment, the centralized planning is very important to a project of development, right? That we can't take away.
Yeah. I mean, part of what's at stake also when confronting a text like this is a desire not to convince people, which I think has been a problem on the left that we deal with quite a ways. That's sort of like you can have the socialist impulse and then you can just do a bunch of projects willy-nilly, and like you can do your little thing with 5 people over there and you can do your little thing with 5 people over there, and like we'll figure it out. It's like, because part of what's at stake, I think, if we think about humanity, in this time period, right, is like, will there be a world that people can live in 50 years? Will there be, like, what levels of violence are we dealing with at a world scale right now imposed by US imperialism, and how are those going to continue to escalate, right? And so I think that it's important on one level. Yes, I'm with like the pulling in and having conversations and developing things with people with different viewpoints that still have that socialist impulse. On the other end, like, part of the value, I think, of the scientific socialist tradition is this deep commitment to study and to, like you said, like things like centralized planning, like things like, because you have to be, especially if we're going to tackle something like climate change, just use as an example. There is no fucking way that's going to happen if there is not some kind of like global direction, right, around how do we combat this thing, and how do we combat the way that capitalism is just a death machine that's going to continue to, so like those are real considerations that I don't think can be managed by small scale projects or by individual, by just the socialist impulse alone, I guess is what I would say.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
All right, so let's go to Gordon's, unless you have anything else on Quan.
No.
All right, cool. So this is a really interesting one. Gordon wrote this one around the time of when it was published, with a couple of minor revisions and editing, but basically, so this one, she said in 2001 it was published. So she starts with like a biblical thing that I didn't fully understand, but the main point was like that there was a group. Yeah, it was basically they have come to turn the world upside down. They have turned the world upside down and are come hither also, right? So I think it's like, I don't know. I would need Reverend Darren to explain this one to me, but basically,
It's
like
kind of like Fanon. It's kind of like,
yes,
yeah, it's kind of like Fanon with his biblical text of like the last shall be first.
yeah. And it's basically also, I think, to propose again that like the idea of a revolutionary subject and is not like, it has this very long tradition. You can go back into the Bible and find it, right? And it doesn't have to be the proletariat and so on and so forth. Yeah. There's
because she builds off of that to then get to this one passage from Cedric where he says, it's a longer passage, but fundamentally the part that she's focusing on is possibly even less troubling for them. They displace a socialist motivation grounded on the insistence that men and women were divine agents for the fractious and weaker allegiances of class, right? Yeah. So this conception of the divine agents is what she wants to talk about. And for her, she says it's not necessarily religious, or that she doesn't want to get bogged down in the idea that this idea of divine agents is something that's just idealist, but more so that we have the ability to produce more things than we are told we can, or that fact that she says it measure our freedom less by what subordinates us and more by what we are capable of divining or developing, right? And I think that's useful in thinking about socialism, right? That the construction of socialism does not have to stop with what capitalism has told us how much we could develop. That socialism can expand, right? And usually when we talk about socialism with people, like just common sensically when having conversations with people, that works in theory, but it won't work in practice, That's commonly a common idea people say. It won't work. It's just in theory because that's just who we are. We are innately individualistic. We're innately greedy. We're innately all these things that capitalism has told us we are. And for me, that passage is trying to say, no, actually, we're more than that. Right? We can be socialistic. We have these abilities to develop an alternative. Our imagination has been dumbed down by capitalism. Right? Yeah, that's how I was reading that part.
I mean, I actually would want to hold on a little bit to this religious idea of divine agents. I mean, I think of, like the literal translation of Hezbollah, right, is the party of God, right? And I think, like, what does it mean, right, like for subjects to think of their work, their political projects as a holy one, and to think that their involvement in it, their sacrifices, right, are of a kind of divine nature, and that when they die, that this is also like the greatest gift when they die for the cause, right? Revolutionary, as Huey said, I'm not going to even say the word because YouTube doesn't like it when we do, but revolutionary S word. That, the difference of dying for the people, right, versus dying for yourself, or dying, and I think that's an interesting thing. Like, people often talk about how within Western frameworks we don't have very much discussion or language around a good death, right? We don't think about what does it actually mean, not just to live a good life, but to die for a higher purpose, right? It's kind of, and it's, it's the kind of secularization and all of this, but also Christianity and the versions of Christianity that we've kind of inherited. We think about death through a language of loss. Now, even people on the right, again, and I think this is where it gets interesting, right? They would say it's a part of God's plan, right? When people dies, right? Like, that's a more conservative, and it's not just the right. There's other communities that have that language, right? I always have issues with that because I think that, like, it then becomes the omniscient, omnipresent God that makes all kinds of decisions, and I always worry about the way that this evacuates agency, right? Or, seeks to provide like a kind of a condolence that sometimes is, really hard, right? Like, you lose a child, right? And you go to their funeral and then you're told that, like, it's part of God's plan. It's like, well, why does God want that from me? Like, it's like, I've always had issues with that particular discourse, but I do think that this notion of being a divine agent, when you look at historical rebellions, historical struggles, wars, so on and so forth, like, whether you're looking at the way that Americans now hopped up on their Christo-fascists, Zionism stuff, are thinking about the war that they're engaging in Iran in kind of religious terms, right? But like, also the flip side of that, right? You look at the resistances being animated, right, by Islam and by dignity and by all of these things, right? And I think that Marxists often don't want to engage with that because it's outside of the kind of secular atheistic framework that is often sort of promoted within Marxism. But that is important in terms of how do you convince people to make the kind of sacrifices that are necessary to change the world when there is so much violence arrayed against you. And I think that is part of why you see, one of the reasons that you see so much conservatism, not politically, but like kind of a risk aversion conservatism, like a left that does not often engage in, dangerous struggle. Not, there are other examples, certainly there are, I think anarchists are more comfortable with that than, like Marxist Leninists are often in the United States context, just to be like very broad. But like, I do think that that's a, and I think Maoists are somewhere in the middle, but that is a very broad, like, thing that I do think has to be contended with, right? Is the
Yeah.
kind of, when you evacuate an idea like divine agency away from something, you're also losing the power that those discourses have to animate and motivate people. And that's something I see Robinson contending with in this book, but also within Black Marxism, right?
Black
Is saying
Marxism,
like,
yeah, definitely, definitely.
why did Haitian people stick their arms into cannons? Like, that kind of stuff. Like you
Hmm.
can't just dismiss this, right?
Yeah, yeah, or that one famous the passage that oftentimes people cite or should cite more often is that the cargo had more than just were just more than property, right? The enslaved were more than just property. They had histories and cultures and faiths and religions and epistemologies with that they brought with them that also inspired the rebellion, that inspired their ability to respond to oppression, right? Um, this passage then building off of that is how she's connecting this divine agent thing, right? So it was the image of men and women as divine agents that registered for me the significance of anthropology of Marxism's critique of Marxism. This image did not conjure up religious solidarity or collectivities of well-dressed parishioners or regressive notions of posthumous justice, although it did remind me of the famous passage from the Acts of the Apostles about the quote-unquote baser sorts who turned the world upside down. Rather, it pinpointed the moral stakes of the Marxian objective and the grace it promises, described eloquently by Robinson as, quote, the recovery of human life from the spoilage of degradation. So again, that part to me is really important, right? The idea again, you have to remember. I'm gonna try to remember that phrase: the recovery of human life from the spoilage of degradation. I think that's such a powerful illustration of what our project is, right? What we're trying to do, all right? But again, that part where as you eloquently described the idea of divine agents, right? That there's something more than just what he was saying, class. That we're not doing this just because of our class. We're doing this because again, our dignity, right? Our ability to fight back against these conditions that we see are unjust, right? That is not just while we have a class analysis of it, it's not necessarily what motivates us, right? To challenge these things. Yeah. So lower she has to conceive of ourselves as divine agents is to see ourselves as the executors, not the supreme rulers, but the guarantors of our world and our imaginations. To ground socialist aspirations in a divine agency is to remove the stigma attached to the utopian and to measure our freedom less by what subordinates us and more by what we are capable of divining. Very powerful point there, I think.
It is powerful. Anytime I read a Robinson book, and I've said this to people many times, it makes me say, you know what? I need to start a church. Like this is the
What
this
the
is the
hell?
way to go. This is the way to
Oh
go.
wow.
Divine agents, the church of
Divine
yeah.
agents.
Anyway,
The
all
Church
right.
of Divine Agents?
Yeah, absolutely.
Of socialist divine agents. Let's be clear.
So
Socialist
yeah,
divine agents.
listen, all of this will be part of our doctrine. All right.
Yes. Well, this one just said this has always been church. LOL. One of the comments.
Yeah, I get it, and that's where some of what we do. Um, so at the bottom of this section, she says at the heart of Robinson's critical project is the exposure of the philosophical and historical compromises Marxism and liberalism have made with bourgeois society, compromises which, among other results, wedded the foundations and promise of socialism to capitalism. It is, in my view, the distinctive contribution of an anthropology of Marxism to refuse those compromises on the grounds that they are not now nor ever have been necessary. It is a critical contribution, like all of Robinson's work, forged in an enormously erudite and gracious spirit of reconstruction. Yeah, I mean, this gets to a lot of question about revisionism versus anti-revisionism for me, about like, and people I imagine would take very different views on this. And I go back and forth on a lot of this kind of discussion, right? Of like the history of socialist states being that they have to perform some kind of jujitsu, right? That they have to perform some kind of like martial art, and we see this right now with like, I mean, God, like what's going on with Cuba right now to bring that up and to talk about it? Because, yesterday somebody silly in the comments was mad because we were talking about something else. And I was like, I didn't even know that this had happened yet today as we were talking. But like, this is going on right now where there's a total blackout. Now there is
that's right.
the flotilla, right? Just arrived today in solidarity to all those people that traveled with, like 4 tons of goods to deliver to Cuba. But that's not inadequate. That's not going to bring fuel. I mean, full shout out to them, but also we need to understand as they understand, right? That like more is necessary.
They understand, exactly. They understand that.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. And the, like Cuba has many times done this of figuring out like, okay, how do we maintain our sovereignty even, and I think that's one of the things that is the difficult project of today with imperialism, that very often just defending sovereignty is what alternative projects of any kind are trying to do, right? Because you live in an era where in this late stage of capitalism and the United States, I think, declining role as a global hegemon, it's looking to use the most extreme versions of coercion and violence to try to reintegrate any project that is outside of it and bring it under U.S. hegemony, whether we see that in Venezuela or Cuba or Iran, or elsewhere, right? And so in that context, I also, and I think in certain extent, that's always been the context for a socialist project. But in the 20th century, there was a bigger block of countries that were trying to do this, that could kind of work together in different ways on different levels. And now it's a smaller, there's still China, however people feel about that. But that is really and that is interesting because of how strong China's economy is now, globally speaking. But nonetheless, a lot of the struggles that we see are these just defenses of sovereignty. And to me, that's very important, that's a basis of being able to do anything. But it also speaks to, the stakes of that, and that there are compromises that are sometimes made in different periods in order to just maintain your project's ability to persist. And so that's a debate, right? About like, what should those compromises look like? To what extent, how do you revalorize or narrate or get, like that the discussion you brought up earlier of Cuba with the battle of ideas and the other things that they did during the special period, right? Of like, how do we reinvigorate this socialism under these really difficult conditions, is a challenge for, states as well. But I understand the point that Dr. Gordon's making here too.
No, for sure. And I think, and then what ends up happening for me is that when these movements are in these states are trying to defend their sovereignty, they oftentimes have internal contradictions of having to use the state to quell certain rebellions or certain protests within their movements, that then we remove out, we ahistoricize it as in, look how repressive they are. Look, they're a regime, right? Rather than saying, well, let's put this in the context of sanctions and U.S.-led imperialism that has created these conditions. And this is not to deny that there's internal issues that are at hand in these places. But if you just look at those internal issues and just study them separately from the global context that you just described, it's a disservice, and you're ignoring the defense of sovereignty here that has to happen to even be able to develop and socially reproduce their society, right? And I think that's unfortunately the part that gets missed oftentimes, right? Or we we start adding fuel to imperialism's attacks on these places. Right?
Yeah. No, absolutely. Do you have to get the door?
Oh no, you heard that? That's good.
Yeah, I mean, I will say this of one thing, and I think it comes up later within Gordon's piece here, but it also is something I was reflecting on a little bit with this book, is that I think one danger of this book, right, is that it can reduce the socialist impulse merely to a battle with authority or repression or oppression in certain ways, right? And so then it could kind of, I think, dovetail with, maybe like work like Hart and Negri's work, or, whatever, like looking at like trying to develop a kind of intersectional approach where you resist all oppressions, and then the the way that you view historical revolutionary agency is in like all the people who are resisting oppression everywhere become the basis of that. And I think that can also lead to pro-imperial politics in certain key conjunctures, because the people who are resisting oppression in certain ways, how you frame it, it depends on like what level are we talking about here, right? You can have, the CIA and Mossad get involved in fomenting a rebellion, right? And that be against the sovereignty of the state that ultimately will mean more degradation of the human lives of all the people within that state, right?
Yeah, for sure.
And I think that's where the one thing that I would say is that the socialist impulse, I think, needs to be combined with, this is where the Marxist analysis is helpful in particular, and the like, particularly as post-Lenin, kind of the anti-imperialist Marxist analysis, right? Being able to really situate the world system. And I think, I mean, it's interesting because Robinson didn't obviously talk in these kind of analytical terms necessarily, but he had a pretty good track record, as far as I could tell, about trying to locate, like his solidarity with Iraq, for instance, I think is a really good example of this, where him understanding that Iraq's resistance to U.S. imperialism, I'm sure, and he I'm sure would acknowledge, full of its own internal contradictions and all of this stuff, right? That it was actually their resistance that made possible a kind of socialist or anti-imperialist position within the core as well, right? And so, he was able to do that in times when other folks that maybe had that kind of like anti-oppression analysis would have said, oh no, like, it's Saddam Hussein, it's the evil dictator, it's this, that, like, so yeah.
Yeah, so I think that's the part. I'm glad you said that, because I think that, yes, like if you read this book, there's that danger. But I think, again, I go back to, if you start from the position of that last passage at the end of this book, you know where this is going, right? If you read this without that last passage, then yeah, I see where you could take it to that direction where you were saying earlier. But if you read and again, it goes back to, I think, some of these texts in general need to be, there's some texts that you could read on their own and just read them and understand this is a primary to get us to understand imperialism. Others, you have to have read other things to understand where they're coming from, right? Again, Lenin's imperialism, just read imperialism. You don't got to read anything before that. That's right. Frantz Fanon, I think, Wretched of the Earth, it's another one that you just read that, right? But there's like, I think, for example, I don't know, Amilcar Cabral's speech in the Tricontinental. You should have some background before you get to read Amilcar Cabral's speech in the Tricontinental, right? I don't think if they just give you that text and be like, here, read this to understand. I don't think so. I think there's some text that you should read beforehand before you get to Cabral's speech, which is an important speech. But you should read the text before you get to that speech, I think, right? And I think this book is an example of that. That you can't read an anthropology of Marxism if you haven't read Marxism. If you haven't gotten the groundings of Marxism first. If you go first to read an anthropology of Marxism and then you read Marxism, then I don't know if it's going to be useful. I think the same thing about Black Marxism, the same thing too, right? If you read Black Marxism without having read any Marxist texts, and I mean reading them seriously, actually studying them. It's going to be a disservice to understanding it, right? So I think Avery Gordon's preface here is kind of doing that work for us, right? Showing us like how do we situate Cedric's work in relationship to our leftist analysis, right? To our radical analysis of capitalism, and it's after we've done the work of reading Marxist theory and understanding socialist practices, right?
Yeah.
Again, if you don't have that background, I think you lose a lot of what he's trying to get us to understand.
Yeah. So there's a couple passages I'll kind of go through. One, she talks about Black Marxism and the Black radical tradition. And then she talks a little bit about this book. So there's a couple pieces I'll just read here quickly. As the book makes abundantly clear, she's talking about Black Marxism here. The Black radical tradition is not a supplement to be appended to a partially flawed but basically sound theoretical edifice of Marxism. Quote, the difference, end quote, as Robinson states, quote, is not one of interpretation but comprehension. Western society has been Black radicalism's location and its objective condition, but not, except in the most perverse fashion, its specific inspiration, end quote. And she says then, it is precisely the mistake of taking what are ultimately contingent conditions and locations, what Robinson calls the social cauldron, as the limit of comprehension and inspiration, which Black Marxism corrects and which Anthropology of Marxism extends. And it is precisely the vision of what has been and could be comprehended as inspiration and as aspiration, which fulfills Black Marxism's ambition. And then she says this other point, this section, the liberation of socialism. An anthropology of Marxism extends and completes Robinson's critique of Marxism undertaken in Black Marxism. Indeed, the book could easily be subtitled The Making of the European Socialist Tradition, where the term making carries the meaning of an active process which owes much to agency as to conditioning, as E.P. Thompson put it. So I just wanted to share those framings as well, because I think that's where this book is very much, and this is part of why I wanted to do this text with you, is that people read Black Marxism all by itself, and they don't actually really understand fully what Robinson's issues are with Marxism. But they also, both of these books are about recovering other traditions of rebellion and resistance, and are interested in spiritual and cultural bases of those resistance that are not tied to the Marxist tradition.
Yeah, and just to read this passage building off of that, right? She's like, Robinson's critique of Marxism is not a rejection in total of Marxist insights, nor a denigration of the commitments made by Marxists. Let's just be clear on that, right? The target of Robinson's critique is the proprietary impulse of Marxism, right? The presumption of the ownership of the properties, the resources, rules, definitions, histories, agencies, legends, imaginations necessary for an adequate practice of liberation. And it's kind of like part conversations you've been having, the things you brought up about different movements that are currently fighting imperialism right now, right? That they have resources, rules, definitions, histories, agencies, legends, imaginations that are not necessarily tied or bounded by our Marxist lens, right? But it's still nonetheless a form of liberation that could lead or get us there, right? And this is what we're seeing currently. So building off of that, I think one last thing I want to share about this part is that, and I'm sure we could have a conversation, is her discussion of Robinson's use of historical materialism, right? That she's saying that he grounds it in a different way, that he is practicing a form of historical materialism that's distinct from the one that we've understood, right? And here she's saying that for Robinson, historical materialism is grounded in the primacy of social struggle, not the primacy of racial capitalism, and thus yields a dialectics without determinism, but with a strong notion of internal contradiction. Right? And so I don't know what your thoughts about that were. As I read that, it just reminded me going back to Antonio Gramsci's essay on the revolution against capital, right? That he was arguing that the Russian Revolution, in a way, was a revolution against how Marx described revolution would happen, right? And in that essay, he's like, how does he describe it? I'm paraphrasing it, but he pretty much says like the way we understand historical materialism is not concretely defined, right? That historical materialism, how we understand it, doesn't always have to be, or is not exactly the way we expect it to be, right? And I feel that kind of like builds off of this point here that Avery's trying to argue, right? That Robinson's analysis is a materialist lens. He is using a historical and a materialist approach, but it's not necessarily building from the position of like Marx starts with his historical materialism starts with the commodity and the production of the commodity. Here he's saying, well, his historical materialism starts from the position of rebellion, of resistance, of resisting oppression. And it goes back to what you're saying, right? The dangers that could lead us to, right? That if we just study oppression, we want to oppress the capitalists. Does that make it a wrong thing to do? No. You know, right? So it's like how we understand oppression and resistance is important too, right? Yeah. But anyway, I wanted to go into that.
Yeah. Discussion. I appreciate it. And I think her work here is interesting. And I think it's also, I mean, I know it's quite controversial among what I would broadly call the Robinsonians of whether Robinson does a version of historical materialism or not, right? Because this gets deep into the question, because obviously he's quite clear in arguing against Marx's, what he defines as Marx's version of historical materialism, which I do feel is a bit of a straw man. You know, I have to be honest, but I do think that the version of historical materialism that he's talking about is one version of it that you see, you know, and it is one that is based upon upholding certain texts. It is a kind of doctrinaire version of historical materialism, I guess. I think that what I would say is I think there are more heterodox or other developments of historical materialism. And I can't remember if I actually talked about this point. I think I started to on a past live stream and lost my train of thought, which happens to me all the time. But Chris Gilbert, when we talked about it, I said something along the lines, talking to him once, of an orthodox socialism or an orthodox Marxism, and talking about how his work or the work of Meszaros and Chavez was not an orthodox Marxism. And he stopped me and he said, "What is an orthodox Marxism?" And I was like, you know, kind of taken aback and was like trying to reflect on like, well, what do I mean by that exactly? And I came to that essentially what I meant from it, from my own interpretation, right, was like Marxism, Leninism as developed by Lenin and kind of elaborated by Stalin to a certain extent, right? And but what his vantage point is that there really is no orthodox Marxism, right? There are people who say we have to hold on to the ideas of Marx and Engels, and like that's all that really they did the best work, and we need to build off of that, right? There are people who say Lenin's contributions become, you know, the kind of orthodox, but then from there you get two branches. You get Trotskyism, right? And you get Stalin's interpretation of this, right? And then from there you get Mao, right? And his divergence with Stalin, right? And so his point was to say there is no such thing as an orthodox Marxism, really, right? And that there are contributions within all of these different branches of this sort of tree of knowledge, if we want to think about it in that kind of metaphorical way, but that you can't really look at any of them, you know, any claim of orthodoxy becomes a kind of claim of a doctrine, right? Or like, you know, rather than looking at them as historically developed and that there's a series of debates that are kind of ongoing throughout these things. And I think that's really important to say. And so I think for me, when I think about something like historical materialism, yes, there are components of it that are elaborated by Marx and Engels, but actually that language of historical materialism also is something that's really developed later. It's not something that Marx and Engels, I don't know that they even ever use that term precisely. But you know, it's an interpretation, right, of the key components of their project that gets arrived at by later Marxists.
Yeah.
And so I say that to just say that I don't think that historical materialism has to have some kind of dogmatic set of rules or whatever that can't be subject to,
Exactly.
you know, scrutiny or analysis.
Yeah. Yeah. No, definitely agree. Right. Yeah. The building of our framing of historical materialism, a lot of folks rely like on the German ideology, right, and how they start to develop their framework through the German ideology, right. But now that's a really good, useful way of thinking about it. I think, right, that the different approaches. For me, the part that she's trying to get us to think about in this discussion here is the idea of like a dialectics without determinism, right? That to me, that goes back to how we started this conversation with Stuart Hall with the Marxism without guarantees, right? That the deterministic aspect of our analysis sometimes, that there will be an ending to something rather than an opening. We start with I always appreciated.
Oh, shoot. Steven's computer might have died for a second. So I'll read out a couple of different passages. Well, hopefully he can get himself back online. Um, so let me read out a little bit of what Gordon says about historical materialism here. Oh, he's back. Maybe. You back?
I'm back. So I don't know what happened. I said
Yeah.
I always appreciated that Stuart Hall and understanding of like, rather than thinking of things in the last instance, like in the last instance it's class, right? We could start with in the first instance it's class, and how does that set up the conditions of our terrain of struggle, rather than it's at the end. That's what it is. It's always at the end, right? No, that's at the beginning. It sets up the conditions, and then how does that leave it open to struggle, right? And I think that's kind of like the approach here that she's saying that he's taking, right? That it's rather open rather than end closed, right?
Yeah. And I mean, you know, just to give a couple of quotes, in Black Movements in America, Robinson quotes Frantz Fanon, but he could be summarizing his own position. Quote, "It was not the organization of production, but the persistence and organization of oppression, which formed the primary basis for revolutionary activity." She says, first, Robinson's historical materialism is grounded in the primacy of social struggle, not the primacy of racial capitalism, and thus yields a dialectics without determinism but with a strong notion of internal contradiction. You read that part about out before, actually. But yeah, I mean, I I have some issues with this a little bit, just because like there's all kinds of social struggles. You know what I mean? And I mean, I do agree that social struggles, and I think this is probably how Robinson would kind of approach it, that these do shape history,
Yeah,
right, in a large way. And I think, but I also think that's quite Marxist to
yeah,
understand that
yeah,
as well.
yeah,
Um, you know, so and I also think that so long as we have capitalism, you know, or in its imperial form, right, as like the primary contradiction, and they are playing this deterministic role in so much of the globe, right, that struggles have to contend with that, and that they will be mediated, propagandized, um, co-opted, or resistant to that in some way, right? And so you can have a social struggle that at the level of appearance appears to be revolutionary, but actually is not, right? And I think that
yeah,
that's where I think that there's a benefit in a lot of the work that kind of Marxists have done on this, to
mhm,
understand that you know, when there's protest, like use the example of protests, right? If there's protests in Cuba, who knows what they're, like we're not going to get a good interpretation of what those are actually about usually, but there could be people who are against the government, so on and so forth, right? But if we don't have an analysis of, if our framework is, oh, like Cuba is repressing its people, we need to free them,
Yeah.
then
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
going to lead us in a
Yeah.
very bad direction
For
rather
sure.
than how do we get the blockade and the sanctions removed? How do we ensure that people in Cuba can get oil, that they can pursue their project in a sovereign fashion, and so on and so forth? And the same thing, even though Iran is not a socialist country, like it has a lot of things, it has universal health care, it has education, right? Like it has things that are that are democratized, that are given to the people. It has revolutionary block of people, right, who are struggling for the defense of their revolution and have an idea of what they want their society to be like,
Yeah.
right? And it is not upon us, in Steve in North Carolina, as who said that recently? I can't remember. But it's not upon Steve in North Carolina, right, to determine like I need to go save the Iranian people from, their dictator or whatever else, right? Like that is a misunderstanding of what solidarity looks like and what your role looks like and what also you can do. You could be ultimately you're going to be like kind of a propagandist on one side of this or not. And are you going to be a propagandist for what imperialism is trying to do right now, or the defense of the sovereignty of this place? So
Yeah, that Steve of North Carolina doesn't speak for this Steven, so yeah. Yeah. No, yeah, for sure. I think that that's a useful point to think about, right? I think that the part, when we think of protests, like again, like I said, if you're not putting the protests in the context of the global capitalist system, like those folks can have legitimate concerns about their issues in their country. That doesn't necessarily mean they want to topple their government. You know what I mean? Like that's the part that always from the outside we're always viewing these movements as, oh, they want to topple their governments. Dude, no, they don't. They just want water, man. They just want electricity. You know what I mean? Like they just want healthcare. Like they want certain things. Just here, there's certain people, liberals in this country that protest the government. They don't want to get rid of this government. They just want better conditions for this place, right?
totally.
But from the outside, like, oh, the government's about to fall. The Cuban government, that's it. It's a failed state. Look, there's one little protest, dude. Come on, really?
Yeah.
Like if we were to define that one protest that has legitimate grievances as an issue with their government, man, this is a failed state where we're living. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
There's probably a protest happening right now in downtown LA as I speak. You know what I mean? Like this is a failed state. There's a protest outside. You know what I mean? Like, so it's just a trip how we don't put those in the context, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think also like even if a few people do want the overthrow of their state, that doesn't mean that it's a representation of, the majority of the people within that country, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. A big
Um,
part of Robinson's work, I think, is this quote that she has, and that I think is in his analysis in general, right? As I've suggested, Robinson operates from a different standpoint, offers an alternative notion of fate in which, quote, we're not the subjects of or the subject formation of the capitalist world system. It is merely one condition of our being, right? That's a very powerful reminder that it's just one condition of our being. Meaning, again, as divine agents, we could create something else, right? This is not our everything, right? Although the relations of production and exploitation really shape the conditions of our existence, doesn't necessarily mean that we can't do more out of that, right? And build more out of that. Imagine the alternative, right? And again, like even when I tell my students, when we think of movies, like movies that you might find revolutionary, at the end of the day, they're still stuck by their liberalism. We can't, even like we can imagine the end. I forgot. I think it's Frederick Jameson that says, right? We can imagine the end of the world, but we can't imagine the end of capitalism, right? So you have all these cool movies that give you this radical alternative, but then at the end, it still brings back capitalism into it, or the relations of exploitation and power under capitalism, right? I think, for example, this is one example I think of. What was that? Not the zombie show, The Walking Dead. There's this one episode where like they escape the zombies and they find like a safe place. And what is a safe place they find? It's the prison, and they pretty much reproduce the prison without the need for the prison, right? Or the fact that their leader is the fucking sheriff, right? They can't create no alternatives even under the apocalypse. We still have to fall under the same logic of the fascist state, right? And so those things exist again, I think, and that's an example of that we have to be able to think alternatives, right? But we don't, because even our own imagination is limited to that, you know?
Yeah. I mean, she has this section on, you know, only the promise of liberation, right? No nice package at the end. She also talks about Robinson's historical materialism and his politics are, in a sense, an expression not of scientific thought, but of utopian thought, for they quote confront bad facticity with its better potentialities.
Although he didn't like the word utopian, she says, right?
Yeah, she says he doesn't like it because of the negative connotations of it, right? And she also, this is another part, in a letter to Marcela Marquez, he wrote that his earliest intentions were, quote, to reopen a door to a special universe where justice reigned as historical practice, as a constant inspiration for present conduct, and as a realizable project. And Robinson did not like the word utopian because of its connotation of naivety and impossibility, but one could see this special universe where justice reigned as historical practice as a kind of utopian world, the kind that emerges precisely from an accretion over generations of collective intelligence gathered from struggle. That line, accretion over generations of collective intelligence gathered from struggle, is from Black Marxism, by the way. And so that part I thought was really a good passage there. And I think that this is another interesting basis, right? Is this focus on justice. You know, often we see that discussion as something that comes up from all kinds of communities, right? It comes up, you know, there's a lot of discussion around justice right now coming from the Islamic world, right? And that's a deep basis within Islam. Um, and that in relation obviously to imperial violence and everything else, right? But I think that's a thing, you know, like people, it's something you have to contend with, right? Because visions of justice um can be quite carceral, and I think there's a question that's always raises a question for me, and it's one of the places where sometimes I have developed disagreement over the years, where I used to probably be more aligned with prison abolitionists, you know, but I think that sometimes, you know, well, I don't want to reproduce the prison like the in The Walking Dead or something like that. That these visions of justice that Robinson's talking about and that Gordon's talking about in this as a kind of animating force, that we need to be in conversation with them. And if, you know, when people are looking for justice in the world, like that's a positive, well, not to put a it's an impulse that we as Marxists and other people should like lean into and seek to, you know, work with, right? Because the world is so unjust, right? The way that capitalism creates our world is so full of injustices that that battle for justice can be quite revolutionary as long as it's articulated in the kind of right ways and it doesn't become, you know, like right-wing victims rights movements or something like that, right? Like it doesn't become about, you know, there's a lot of ways that's the challenge of justice, I think, is that it can be articulated also in a lot of really reactionary ways as well. But
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah.
Was there anything else, Stephen, in this section from Gordon that you wanted to
No, I
talk
think
about? I mean,
I think we've covered it. I think the importance of, again, the recovery of human life from the spoilage of degradation. I think that, to me, is the carry thing to carry with us, right? Like, how has this impulse kept coming back, right? And again, the resistance has to be grounded in that idea, right? I think our opposition against oppression has to be against that. Not, you're oppressing me from the ability to exploit others, or you're oppressing my ability to own private property, or you're oppressing my ability to own 3 homes, right? Like, no, I'm oppressing you from continuing the degradation of humanity.
yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I mean, in final thoughts for me on the book, just to kind of summarize them quickly, I think it is an important read. I wish that he didn't go so hard at like Marxisms in certain ways, like I do. I disagree with him on some of those elements for sure, and think that some of the emphasis that he's putting on those things throughout the text, like I think what's interesting, right? I guess what I could say would be a project that would be more interesting to me, which he didn't do, would have been for him to take those figures that he cited at the end, that he said drew inspiration from Marxism, but had this, powerful liberatory role in the 20th century, and have him analyze them and the movements that they came out of, and what he thought about all of that. That would have been really interesting for me to see where he landed on a lot of that. um, and I think that's often what people assume that Black Marxism would be
Mhm.
about, and are disappointed when they encounter that book, that it is not at all about that, essentially. And that it's the critique often of that last chapter where he focuses on Du Bois, CLR James, and Richard Wright, is that why didn't you focus on Cabral and Fanon and Nkrumah and so on and so forth. um but I think that the positives of the book, aside from my disagreements or hair splitting around historical materialism or what is Marxism and all of that, are the recovery of this European socialist tradition, and to add that, right, to
Yeah.
bring in this longer history, to bring in these movements that have been purposefully erased from history. Like, I don't think Marx and Engels were attempting to erase them from history in a sense, like
No.
they thought that they had better empirical grounds to like move forward with the socialist project, and that we
Yeah.
needed to kind of shift the way a lot of these discourses that came out of that to a more scientific mode. But I can see how the way that they did that does dovetail also with the erasure of history that would have been done by like the bourgeois side of things, that just wants them removed because they don't want people to ever know that people
Right.
resist these systems,
Yeah.
And so I think it's good to know that there are those traditions within European history in addition to the Marxist tradition, and that allows us also to, even from a even when discussions of Europe or European thought and socialism and so on, to add in to say, yeah, we also had these religious socialist movements and traditions and so on and so forth. And so we don't need to privilege this, totally privilege this secular discourse. The last thing I would say is that I think that the analytical and rigorous intellectual work, that there's a lot of it that has been done inclusive, within a Marxist tradition, that we can't let go of, and that are really useful tools for all struggles, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. My thing is, again, like I said earlier, that if you want to encounter his work or read his work, I would invite you to read it alongside Marxists, right? Not to read him as someone that says don't read Marx and Marxism, right? Or to abandon the project of Marxism, right? I think his work is more about what are the limits or gaps within Marxism, not to throw it away, but to improve it for me specifically, right? And I think, again, others might not read it that way, but for my own use, for my intellectual development, it's allowed me to expand my understanding, right? To have a Marxism without guarantees, building off of Stuart Hall, right? To understand a materialist analysis that doesn't ignore the role of movements that might not necessarily be Marxist, right? That my materialist analysis is incorporating and trying and be more expansive than limiting, right? That I could understand the movements that are going on the other side of the world that might not necessarily take a Marxist lens, but I understand that their materialist conditions are and pushing them to have to do what they need to do, right? So I think for me, that's what this text has been useful for. I appreciate you, offering to do this reading collectively and opening it up for others to engage. I think, again, Cedric, his ideas beyond just Black Marxism are very useful. So if I think of, again, the appropriation of Frantz Fanon, that essay is one of the best essays I've read on Fanon. His essay on Amilcar Cabral and the dialectics of imperialism are an excellent essay as well. Relationship, and that ties me back to that point that I think what Cedric's arguing is really similar to what Cabral was arguing, right? Where he's like, just that we have to remember that people are not fighting for theories or ideas. They're fighting to feed their family. They're fighting to make sure people are housed, right? And that when we get bogged down by just we're fighting for a theory or analysis, we're missing the point of people's struggles, right? They're not necessarily fighting to uphold Marxism. They're fighting because they're hungry. They're fighting because they don't have a roof over their heads. But the Marxist analysis helps us understand, well, what got us there in the first place? And that's what he's saying, right? That Marxism gave us the lens to understand the capitalist system. That doesn't necessarily but that doesn't tell us why people struggle. That just gives us an analysis of the system.
Yeah. No, right on. It made me think too of another Amilcar Cabral quote that I'm going to try not to butcher, but it's something along the lines of like, it's about shadows.
Paraphrase.
Yeah. Well, no, I'm trying to remember it because it's like, it's essentially like our job is not to fight against shadows, but against the thing that produces the shadows.
Oh, wow.
Right. And like it's something along I have it more than that. It's more than that. Yeah. But that's one of the things that I would say is the value of Marxism, right? Is that a system like capitalism, from my perspective on it, it can produce, or even if it isn't the only thing that produces these things, right? Because there's cultures, there's religions, there's all other kinds of things that produce, for instance, oppressions, right? But without going after capitalism and imperialism, without centering that as the thing that needs to be stopped, right? Or the thing that we need to create real defensible space to fight against or whatever, that you can end up constantly fighting shadows that are produced by the system. And this is where I think a lot of liberals end up falling in, is that there are specific shadows produced by the system that they get constantly drawn into struggle to fight. And so I think the role of Marxists is not to say, and this is very hard to do and not to do in a kind of paternalistic, cynical way and all of that, right? But like to be like, okay, like I'm going to fight this thing with you, but I also want to help with the analysis around this so that we understand that the thing that you are fighting is not just because of Donald Trump, right? Or it's not just because of, whatever, like Christine Nome, you know, or something like this, right? That there's something deeper here that we have to stay in this fight together in order to stop. And, you know, yeah, we can fight it on a local level, right? Um, but we can't get too caught up in some of these shadows that we get directed to fight at as if they're the like sole basis of, you know, all these, because there'll be new shadows, you know what I mean? So I don't know, that's kind of what I was thinking.
Yeah. Oh, I gotta check that out. I've never read
I'll
that.
I'll find it. It's in I believe it's in I think it's in Return to the Source, like that collection of essays at some point. Yeah. Yeah.
I have to return to that. That's
Um,
good. Yeah.
yeah. All right. All right, peace everybody. We're gonna get out of here. Stephen, thank you so much for
No,
doing
thank
this with
you, man.
me.
You appreciate
This
it.
has
Hopefully,
been
again,
this is
hopefully it was useful for others. You know, hopefully people could return to it and find it useful as they're doing their own study of it. Again, I invite everyone to just check it out. You know.
yeah, no, absolutely. I think that is from Amilcar Cabral's Return to the Source, one of the speeches that he has there. I will yeah, I'll come we'll do something more on that. But yeah, anyway, it's definitely an Amilcar Cabral quote. But anyways, peace. Thank you, Stephen.
All right, man.